Everything's ready.
How's everybody today? Is Mike on? So thank you all for coming, especially those of you that have traveled in. We have 5 reports to present to you today for a vote. We have readouts on the other working groups. Before we get to the business at hand today, we want to make sure that we have the necessary number of folks here, either here in the room or on the bridge. So we're going to take a little bit more time to do that than we would usually do, and I'm going to ask Mike Rouleau who can pick that up and take care of that.
Thanks, Jeff. So I tried to get a quick count of folks in the room. So I'm going to skip over anyone who might be in the room. If you're here, just let me know you're here. Otherwise, we need to get some attendees from the ones on the bridge. So with that, let me go through roll, and then we'll turn it over to Admiral Simpson for some remarks, and then we can get started with our reports today. So looking for folks on the phone, if you could just say aye that you're here. Donna Bethay Murphy. Oh, sorry. Howard Brown. Donna Dodson.
Here.
Oh, Howard's here. Donna Dodson. Craig Donaldson. David Donovan. Andy Ellis. Pete Fonash. Oh, Brian. Brian Fonts.
Aye.
Robert Gesner.
Aye.
Brenton Green.
Aye.
Joseph Lorenzo Hall.
Aye.
Rodney Jaffe. Omar Khan.
Kim Titus here for Omar Khan. Aye. Kim Titus here for Omar Khan. Aye.
Okay, thanks. Brett Kilborn.
Aye.
Elise Kim.
Brett Kilborn. Aye.
Okay. James Linnell. Alice Lippert. John Madden.
John Madden.
Okay, I heard that. Oh. Okay. Danny McPherson.
Danny McPherson.
Moran Nazari. Henry Wayne Pacine.
Here.
Matthew Rontanen. Rod Rasmussen. Francisco Sanchez. Okay. William Scully. Bill Smith. Steve Souter. Dorothy Spears Dean.
I'm here on the bridge.
Thanks. Craig Spiesel.
Good morning. I'm here. Thank you.
Thanks. Joe St. Sauer.
Good morning. I'm here. Thank you.
This is Matthew Rantanen. I'm here.
Thank you. Christian Volger. Errol Weiss. The Honorable Pamela Whitmer. And Eric Woody. Okay, I think we have a quorum, so we can proceed.
This is Ann Miles. My name was not called. I'm on the bridge.
Okay, thanks.
Rao Vasireddy, I'm on the bridge too.
My name was not called. I'm on the bridge.
This is Matt Rantanen. I could not answer in time to when you called my name. I'm here.
Gotcha. All right, thanks.
Matt Rantanen. I could not answer in time.
So with that, I will turn it over to Admiral Simpson for some remarks.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us here today at the 5th meeting of CSRIC 4. Today's agenda is packed with updates regarding communication challenges that reflect the important issues to the FCC, but more importantly to the nation. We thank you for all the hard work, and I mean that, a lot of hard work has gone on since we last met, that went into developing the reports that you will be presenting to address these challenges and the recommendations on which you'll be voting to send to us today. Let me take this opportunity to provide you an update on recent FCC activities related to the work of the CSRIC and remind you that underlying all of these activities, we continue to strive for proactive market accountability, supported by meaningful assurance to internal corporate leadership, your business partners, and the public. This emphasis on measurement and accountability is the foundation of our new paradigm challenge to the communications sector that we talked about during our last CSRIC meeting. We want stakeholders to create this new paradigm of business-driven cybersecurity risk management that will be a measurable, accountable substitute for traditional prescriptive regulation. We don't want to define the checklist and then require you to do the checklist. We really want to have you be doing those things where a checklist may be required internal to your own organizations. We want to be assured that you're evaluating the risk in your environment that you're competing in and providing services in, and that you're sharing those elements of risk that are germane to our task and the other government stakeholders' task of ensuring that we don't leave the public short with regard to the acceptance of unacceptable degrees of risk. So we're excited about working with you to define the details of that new paradigm. We want to work with you to do this, not because it's just the right thing to do for the Commission or it's the right thing to do for the public safety responsibilities we have, but we really believe that the best way to meet those goals is to also help you meet your goals to continue to be competitive and good at providing reliable, secure services in the market that you've chosen to compete in. That where we can align those two goals, we will get the greatest, most mutually satisfying degree of success. So throughout this, as we make progress in this risk-driven approach, that regular adjustment to find the sweet spot, and when we get away from the sweet spot, come back to the sweet spot of addressing societal needs. I think Robert Mayer said that very good last night at an event we were at, with the creative, innovative juices and the capital required to turn that into reality that the private sector is so good at bringing to bear. We think this new approach will be more flexible and dynamic, than reactive compliance with regulation, and more demonstrably effective than blindly trusting the market. I'd like to be crystal clear. The key principle of the chairman's proposed paradigm is proactive, accountable cyber risk management at the network owner-operator level, as opposed to reactive compliance with prescriptive mandates. It's about accountability among market participants to customers, business partners, investors, insurers, and all other elements of the market for communications products and services. With that comes an obligation of transparency. Not transparency in everything you're doing, but a degree of transparency required to ensure that accountability is appropriately recognized among those stakeholders I just outlined. We absolutely want this approach to be voluntary, meaning that companies implement good cybersecurity practices because doing so is good for your bottom lines, your profits, your return on your investments, and your protection against losses. In this context, voluntary means that companies want to secure their networks and they want to do so for their own purposes, not just because the government told them they had to. Let me describe a little bit about how this fails. If voluntary means, oh, it's voluntary, I don't have to do it. That's the way my kids react to voluntary. This paradigm will fail. If voluntary means, oh, they're not going to tell us how to do it. We agree on the end goal. Let's ourselves proactively assess what needs to be done and do so in a way where, wow, my kid did their college applications. I don't have to get engaged there. They did that on their own. One of them did. Two of them didn't. But mom helped in that case. In short, the new paradigm is proactive, business-driven cyber risk management by the companies who own and operate the networks, the companies who are accountable for the performance of those networks. This proactive posture is distinct from the old paradigm of reactive compliance with the government mandate, which I know will never keep up with the pace of innovation or the pace of cyber threats. We simply won't be agile enough to follow where the adversaries are going or where industry takes us if government prescriptively defines this. Developing methods of measurement and accountability is really kind of the next step that we are currently working with you on and will continue to need to crack. It's the hardest nut. How do companies measure this risk and hold themselves accountable for that, and how well are they managing those risks? I want to mention a couple of high-profile initiatives that we have underway at the FCC that we're challenging communication companies to answer that hard question. First is implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework, a very important contribution to our nation's cyber defense, and now it is up to all of us to implement it in the real world. The framework, I believe, gets things right in a very fundamental way. It is a risk management tool, not the checklist we talked about. The framework provides a common language and conceptual understanding for communicating and managing cyber risk throughout a company at all levels, from the IT department to the boardroom and the C-suite, and also externally to customers, business partners, investors, and the public. It's just common enough where that dialogue can occur in a fruitful way, in a consistent way, but not so common that it can't be something you own for your company, for your needs. Such an understanding is indispensable to managing cyber risks, and the framework provides companies the ability to manage these risks in a way that is as flexible and dynamic as the market itself. It allows companies to do what they need to do, identify risks, and then invest according to their own individual needs to address those risks, while also providing a language that the broader market can understand as well. We think if you're going to own it, you'll do it right because it's important for your goals. Here's what that means for us. We've tasked CSRIC, under the leadership of Working Group 4, to develop and recommend voluntary mechanisms in accordance with the framework to provide that macro-level assurance to the FCC and the public that communication providers are taking the necessary corporate and operational measures to manage cybersecurity risks across the enterprise. We are asking private sector communication companies to generate the sufficiency thresholds for their own internal cybersecurity controls, and then, as a substitute for traditional regulation, hold themselves accountable to those internal controls, and reveal to the critical stakeholders, including the public and the Commission, relevant information about the progress and the challenges. That's the transparency element here. What element needs to be transparent to us, and what element is a level of detail that we don't need to see? In this approach, the companies themselves and the market more broadly would be the primary accountability mechanism to ensure the sufficiency of cyber defenses. We love it when the market works. It brings investment to the right opportunity much better than anything we could do. The framework is simply common language that facilitates this accountability and makes it more efficient, makes the market more efficient. This approach would be the opposite of the traditional prescriptive checklist-oriented regulation. If we have enough adjectives in there, you'll really know that we don't like that. We believe that CSRIC's efforts to implement the framework will provide a groundbreaking opportunity for companies to take that real ownership I described of cyber risk management for your best interests and for the prosperity of the broader communications sector market. Will the market always proactively address the issues? No, it won't. And I think it would be naive of us, any of us, to think that there won't be niche areas where oh my God, there wasn't sufficient market pressure to proactively get after a significant public interest that needs to be solved before failures occur, or certainly before failures repeat. I believe that the work that you all are doing on the framework and optimizing it for each of your subsectors will allow us to more rapidly uncover those areas where the market alone isn't driving the right solutions to bring to bear so that the failure doesn't occur in a way that would put at risk public interest. So that's the first response when the market isn't doing it, that the framework's transparency and the discussion between sectors teases out those areas, and we can then bring the solutions, the technical solutions that were honed from that right investment put towards need where there is a market into those areas where the market underserves. Failing that is when the FCC would need to then, I think, work a little more closely with the industry to say, whoa, the technical solutions don't work there, or we need to do more. But we would want to do that around that niche part of the market, the part where market forces aren't generating the right degree of resilience or robustness. So as you continue to work through the rest of the CSRIC, I'd ask you to think about not just how is this organized when it works, but how do we organize to take advantage of what we're doing with the framework so that when it falls short, and it will fall short in some of those areas where the market isn't as robust, 911, for example, how are we setting this up so that this can support non-regulatory responses to proactively correcting the resiliency and reliability issues in those areas. Companies will provide macro-level assurances that demonstrate how communication providers are reducing cybersecurity risks through the application of the framework or an equivalent construct. These assurances can be tailored by individual companies to suit your unique needs, characteristics, and risks. The assurances will be based on meaningful indicators of successful and unsuccessful cyber risk management. They will allow for meaningful assessments both internally and externally. We're not looking for reports of cyber minutia and regular reports to CISOs at communication providers. Cyber minutia is something we want the CISOs to deal with. We don't want to deal with that. But we are looking for those macro indicators and want you to help us with that. We are encouraged by the progress being made in Working Group 4 towards this goal. Really encouraged. And my senior staff recently participated in that working group's face-to-face meeting and witnessed firsthand the significant work that has been accomplished and your plans to address the challenges that remain with the chairman's new paradigm. I should say with our new paradigm. The stage is set for success, and now we must deliver on it. I look forward to hearing your status update later in the agenda today. The second area addresses our collective efforts to harden the Internet infrastructure. Between 2011 and 2013, CSRIC addressed some of the most difficult and intractable problems that afflict the core Internet. secure interdomain routing, secure domain name system, and botnet remediation. CSRIC brought key stakeholders together in a collaborative public-private process that resulted in practical recommendations for cybersecurity improvements, and in March 2012 unanimously adopted recommendations in all three areas. We recently sought comment, not just in these three areas, but additionally in recursive domain issues, from a wide variety of stakeholders about the implementation and effectiveness of these recommendations. What has worked and what hasn't? What lessons can we learn? What are the barriers to success? Are there qualitative or quantitative evaluation methods that would be valuable to develop further? These are very important questions and indicative of our emphasis on measurement and accountability. The purpose of the request we made is to promote that robust stakeholder-driven discourse to provide the comm sector and the FCC itself new insights and situational awareness regarding innovative solutions to these particular cyber risks. But we need to get after these cyber risks. It's too important to the consumers we support and to the other sectors, critical infrastructure sectors that rely on us. Stakeholders in the market have crucial insights about all of these cyber questions, and we at the FCC want to orient our approach to cybersecurity around this owner-operator expertise. We've begun to receive valuable input from many of you. I'm encouraged by those discussions, and we look forward to continuing to hear from the rest of you. This is a very valuable discourse, and we hope another important example of proactive, business-driven solutions. Now, normalization across the sector is going to be very key. We've heard from a lot of the larger companies. It's very important that we work this across the entire fabric, so we want to make sure that we run through the end on this one. I'll run through the other important updates that we're looking forward to discussing today. Working Group 1, Next Generation 911, co-chaired by Brian Fonts of NENA and Lori Flaherty of NHTSA, will deliver their final report on location accuracy and testing for VoLTE. The report looks at the impact on carriers generating and delivering location information to PSAPs as they transition from 2G and 3G and 4G networks to VoLTE networks, and the impact that simultaneous operation of both networks during the transition will have on carriers' overall wireless location performance. And I'm looking forward to hearing those recommendations. Working Group 5, chartered to look at remediation of server-based DDoS attacks, co-chaired by Michael Glenn of SecurityLink and Peter Fonash of DHS, will deliver their final report. The report identifies a focused set of best practices to address server-based DDoS attacks, maps those best practices to both a network operator remediation model as well as the NIST cybersecurity framework, prioritizes those best practices based on impact and implementation difficulty, and addresses challenges and lessons learned based on operator experience. I think that you'll find this report extremely valuable, as I did when I read it, or at least when I read the draft. And I want to thank all the members of the working group that contributed to its development. I especially want to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts of one of its co-editors, Bob Thornberry, who, despite being under the weather and really pretty significantly ill during compilation of the final report, continued to provide significant contributions to finalize and align the best practices to the NIST framework. Bob, we greatly appreciate your dedication and are glad you're feeling better. That DDoS report is significant, but as I was talking earlier to Michael Glenn, I think it brought us to the red zone. It's football season, I can say that. I think we got 10 more yards to go until we're using it regularly across the industry in each of the sectors. And Michael brought up with where we connect to outside our borders, other countries and their carriers, we really won't have achieved the effects that we're looking to achieve. So help us help you in the final 10 yards so we can get it across the goal line. Working Group 6, long-term core Internet protocol improvements, chaired by Bill Check of NCTA, will be delivering their final report. Bill, along with his DNS and routing subgroup leads, Matt Tooley from NCTA and Tony Tauber from Comcast, will be presenting their findings and recommendations regarding long-term remedies to these protocol vulnerabilities. And we look forward to hearing those recommendations. And I haven't read a draft there, so I'm very much, Bill, looking forward to hearing what you guys have done on that. Working Group 7, Legacy Best Practice Updates, chaired by Kyle Malady of Verizon, is delivering their final report that takes a fresh look at 476 legacy best practices that have not been reviewed since CSRIC 2. In addition, the final report considers a set of proposals made by ADIS and the Network Reliability Steering Committee. I thank you for this work and look forward to your recommendations. This has particular interest for me because having witnessed a number of tech transitions, the greatest risk is quite often not in the new bleeding edge thing where you've built risk mitigation strategies effectively, but it's in the retirement of legacy systems when there is no more new investment money around technical solutions. The supply chains begin to dry up for replacement parts, and the surrounding ecosystem is marching on to the new thing, so the interfaces regularly change. So while it's old, I'm very interested in ensuring that we're appropriately mitigating risk in this section. Working Group 10, Customer Premise Equipment Powering, chaired by Tim Walden of CenturyLink, will be delivering their final report on best practice recommendations for powering consumer devices during commercial power failures. I am very interested in this one since I gave the gals such a hard time on the last one, which was what can consumers do to think about the power, loss of power in their homes. I really am looking forward to understanding what the carriers believe their obligations are and how the CSRIC can ensure that consumers have a clear expectation of what can be done to ensure continuity of power for critical communications goes beyond the onset of a disaster. An extremely important concern, and I look forward to hearing your recommendations. As you can see, the FCC continues to work these pressing communication challenges together with you, our stakeholders, to seek solutions that draw on the business-driven principles of the new paradigm. In doing so, our emphasis on proactive market accountability underlies everything the CSRIC does. Today, I look forward to hearing from all the working groups, including the 5 working groups that will be issuing reports and recommendations, and those updating their status. And especially know that I'm interested in how you address measurement and accountability in the recommendations you provide to us. Thank you all.
Thanks, Admiral. Before we get started with the rest of the program, I just wanted to ask the folks on the bridge, I think you're having a little bit of trouble hearing, maybe a lot of trouble. There's a couple things that we can do. One thing we suspect is that there may be folks on the bridge that don't have their line on mute. So please mute your lines if you're not speaking. We'll try and do something about it on our end as well. Not sure if we can yet, but in the meantime, please mute your lines. And when we go to take a vote that calls on folks on the bridge to weigh in, we'll ask you to unmute if that's needed. All right. So.
Just one other note on the bridge. Do not put us on hold, please, so we don't listen to whatever your music on hold is. So anyway, let's get started with the reports and recommendations. I'm going to mix it up a little bit because we have some time constraint with individuals. So let's start with Bill Check and the long-term Internet protocol recommendations.
You're controlling the slides? Ah, okay. All right, good. Okay, Working Group 6. Good afternoon, and I'm pleased to present this final report of Working Group 6, the long-term Internet protocol improvements. Working Group 6 had a wide variety of participants. We've had meetings and discussions taking place really over the past year. And this took, of course, time and commitment and resources from all these individuals. And I'd like to thank everyone who participated in Working Group 6 for their contributions. I'd also like to thank Jeff Goldthorpe for his leadership and to thank Curry and Jacob, for our FCC liaison, for his help and support as well. Okay, Working Group 6 was chartered to look at improvements to the domain name system and to the Border Gateway Protocol. Now, earlier CSRIC working groups have also looked extensively at DNS and BGP, both in CSRIC 2 and in CSRIC 3. And given the thorough review of these technologies by the earlier working groups, Working Group 6 believed it was best to focus on two topic areas within the DNS and BGP areas. For DNS, the group focused on open recursive DNS servers, as they have been and continue to be a prime target for malicious actors to use for attacks. BGP has been in use over 2 decades for exchanging router information between administrative domains. And while it's shown itself to be largely robust and scalable to meet the growing and changing needs of the Internet, there have been some interruptions due to structural weaknesses. Our subgroup chairman, Tony Tauber from Comcast, who led the BGP effort, and Matt Tooley from NCTA, who led the DNS effort, did an outstanding job of leading their respective groups, and I'd like to acknowledge all their efforts. So, to get into the details, I'd like to turn the mic now over to Tony. He'll present on the interdomain routing subgroup, and then Matt will follow him, who will present on DNS, and then we'll take questions at the conclusion of both of those presentations. Tony?
Thanks, Bill. So the next slide, please. Oh, I advance, okay. So I'm going to start by telling you discussing the approach that we took with our subgroup study. Given that CSRIC 3 had also examined routing security, we sought to take a fresh approach to the topic as much as we could, following on that group's effort in about 12 or 18 months after it concluded. First, we wanted to define a taxonomy so we could discuss the topic with some precision and consistency. Second, much of the interest in CSRIC and the general public in the topic came from some highly publicized events, so we thought we'd review those. The third major thrust pertains to measurement and tools related to routing security. Measuring the global routing system isn't easy and continues to be a fertile area for research. On the taxonomy side, I'll walk you through a few key terms needed to describe the problem. Overload is a common enough result of something going wrong in the network, either accidentally or through malice. Resources that may be overloaded include network links or processors, whether those processors are in routers or servers. In the network community, we say something got black holed when traffic bound for the destination gets dropped, that is sent to the bit bucket, somewhere between the intended, the sender and the intended recipient. If a route is misoriginated, that's to say that someone other than the legitimate party has injected it into the routing system. To say something is hijacked seems to inherently suggest malice. Some goals of hijacks might be to enable traffic interception, analysis, eavesdropping, or censorship. When routing information is leaked, that means it is propagated beyond where it was intended. Most often, this outcome results from an accidental misconfiguration. The result is that traffic follows an unintended path. It's possible that eavesdropping or traffic analysis is the motivation, but even more often what happens is an overload situation. Particularly, this is the outcome if an edge network begins to transit traffic unintentionally. Turning to the routing incidents that have come up recently, a company called Renesys made a big splash in the news when they presented an analysis of routing anomalies that they observed through their measurement system, and they concluded by the targets, which were included the financial institutions and banks among them, that malice was the probable intention. The fact that some of the actors seemed to be based in Eastern Europe helped to fan the flames in public consciousness. An apparent misconfiguration having to do with the so-called Great Firewall of China resulted in a massive amounts of traffic being sent to a small hosting provider in the Midwestern U.S. Analysis that was done of that suggests that DNS misconfiguration behind the firewall was the actual cause, not a routing situation. A more vanilla apparent accident was perpetrated by a provider based in Thailand, although it was the second such involvement by that party in the last several years. So that was the so-called Indosat incident. On the tools and measurement side, we heard that CSRIC was interested in measurement related to their activities, as the admirals described already. And in the area of routing security, significant academic and some amount of commercial development has been done in this area. Two kinds of measurements seem particularly relevant. Those related to the behavior of the overall routing system, globally, and those related to the population of the RPKI, the Resource Public Key Infrastructure. It's very hard to study the overall routing system, and no commonly agreed upon measures of routing anomalies, much less incidents, has yet been devised, but it continues to be a fertile area for study. Turning to the RPKI, since the contents are publicized and published by definition, some tracking of the information in there is possible and has been done. So we'll get into more of that. Our analysis, going back to the previous slide, our analysis broke down along a variety of axes: the purpose, coverage, enterprise type, data sources and components, operational status. Some tools, going through these, some tools seek to survey reachability and some seek to show dynamics. Some are commercial, most are non-commercial or academic. Since they need information from as much of the global routing system as possible, basically BGP feeds from as many service providers as they can get, most rely on the same sets of data because it's hard to get that set up with the whole world of service providers for each study. So they really, many rely on the same data that's gathered by either the Route Views project or the RIPE Routing Information Service, although some commercial actors have been able to get their own system in place. Some are done by graduate students, but aren't maintained past the duration of their particular study, and certainly aren't guaranteed to be available 24/7. So their usefulness in an operational setting can be sort of limited. So getting into the recommendations from the group, from the subgroup, these break down into reaffirm, continue, and expand the recommendations from CSRIC 3 Working Group 4. That was involved route filtering and source address filtering, best practices, and the source address filtering is something that people often cite and refer to by the BCP, Best Current Practice 38, as published by the IETF. Second, we advise the operator community to monitor the activities of the IETF Secure Interdomain Working Group to make sure that what's going on there is practical to them and engage in the multi-stakeholder process to get the best outcomes. And there are other venues and fora that are available and working on that to also with the deployment advice and such as regional operator groups, and the Internet Society has convened international interest. So there's work ongoing to expand that. And lastly, the last main recommendation is continue with RPKI population, registering secure route information objects, and then testing with relying party software that takes that data in and processes it for to get a sense of what is the correct and authorized origin for a given route piece of routing information. To get some familiarity with it, see how it can work, make sure that the medicine isn't worse than the disease, and really kick the tires on it as it grows. Lastly, we included an appendix called the RPKI Getting Started Guide, which was we thought it'd be helpful to give some guidance on getting started for service providers in a form that could appeal to a variety of network administrators, because some of them are not service providers, they're enterprises or other sorts of end users who don't really deal with interdomain routing, as part of their main job. It's probably just a small piece of what they do. But we wanted to give them a sort of a guidebook to getting started with it, that's separate from the IETF publication series, which is quite technical and detailed protocol specification, and a somewhat different bent than what's available from the regional internet registries, who are the other main players in this area. So that is, they have a different goal with their documentation, since they're part of the solution. And that concludes my piece of it, and I can turn it over now to Matt Tooley for the DNS report.
Question.
Oh, before I leave, yeah.
On your second last slide,
okay.
You mentioned that you had done some work on RPKI, sort of, I don't know, I guess I'll use the word promoting the experimentation with RPKI,
right,
and so forth. I'm wondering if the group was able to sort of summarize any of the learnings, experiences, where are folks with the use of the I call it a test bed, right?
Right. The group didn't do a survey per se. One thing that is available, the folks at NIST, for instance, there's other folks I think over in Europe who've done this. Since, as I mentioned, the RPKI data is published and publicized, they can sort of monitor it and see how many objects are in there. What are all the objects? How many are in there? See the growth of it over time. So there's that information's available. What they can't see is what people are then doing with the data. Are they using it actively for routing decisions yet or not? That information isn't really publicized and available at this point. People, I think, anecdotally are starting to, what I've found from the service provider forums, starting to experiment with it and consider adding it into their routing decision process. But it's been sparse.
People feel when they're doing that, the folks that are doing that, are they feeling confident that the data that they're getting are helping them make better routing decisions? How's that going? We didn't really do a survey per se of that. I think in the U.S. Altering the routing decisions has been pretty sparse in the uptake. I've heard anecdotal things about overseas operators who are working with it, but that's where it's at this point. Okay.
Two questions.
Sure.
You early on described a couple of challenges
mm-hmm.
that the group had related to the lack of a standing model or modeling environment for this, and the inadequacies of canned data to really just evaluate the dynamic flows, and I presume the timing of actions taken in the exchange for the kinds of variety of situations that you'd see in the real operational environment. Are these areas something that the industry should take on to say, well, let's not just rely on a college here or there to do some good work in this area? Should we begin to, as an industry, maintain some degree of modeling for the environment so that we can do this more dynamically in the future?
It's an active area for research, and so, for instance, one thing that I know has been going on, and hopefully some results will be publicized soon. The Internet Society convened some study, and what's good about them is they can do it transnationally, to take some of the routing anomaly data from one of these services and make it available to people for then categorization along the lines of, is it, a false positive? Is it a real, which of a couple of different real events might it describe? A malicious hijack or an accidental thing, and so that's ongoing work, and hopefully it will be published soon. But and there's more academics working on it, so it continues. As far as the industry doing it, it's unfortunately it's got to be an international effort. So it's a matter of promoting it, raising the awareness of it. There's another Internet Society effort that's going on called the Routing Resiliency work. What do they call it? Well, they're trying to get a routing resiliency manifesto published, and what they call it manners. The what is it? Routing norms. Now I'm blanking on what the acronym stands for, but at any rate, it's a published set of routing norms, and so. So to promote the interest in it internationally, and sort of keeping people aware of the priority in the many different things that they have to consider, security-wise for network providers.
I would just offer that in my experience defending large global enterprise networks, mm-hmm. that when we committed to an accurate model of the environment, even though every object wasn't necessarily modeled, but categories of objects were in. It allowed us to conduct dynamic evaluations that really improved our ability to defend. So it had R&D value. Mm-hmm. It also had training value. And the third area is that it really helped us in the response to actual attacks to say, oh, well, boy, let's evaluate that theory in a known good model that we've got experience with. The second question I have is on the RPKA progress, and it's good to hear that NIST can track RPKI implementation progress, although it falls short of the operational utilization of RPKI. Mm-hmm. Will the group provide recommendations for the FCC on that part of transparency I talked about before? How do we, in fact, get a sense of, are we 10% of the way there? Are we 90% of the way there? Are we 100% of the way there with the satellite companies, but wireless only got 5%?
It doesn't, as far as I know at this point, seek to align it with particular entities. That might be an area for some kind of
We're looking for measure. So just
understood.
Put that in the back of your for this paradigm to work.
Yep.
We've got to have a sense on if you tell us RPKI is important as we go forward in the validation of originating address and to thwart the different attack mechanisms you discussed, that we believe that,
right,
and want to get a sense of how's it going.
Right. Understood.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Great. Good afternoon. Let's see. There it is. Okay. So the DNS subgroup opted to look at what's commonly referred to as the open resolver problem. So what I put up here on the slide is basically illustrating the open resolvers, or what we're calling in the report open DNS recursive servers, being used in a DNS-based DDoS attack. The open resolvers themselves provide a large attack surface for DDoS attacks. So the group itself elected for the scope to look at, okay, how do we mitigate this problem? And so that's what we're going to talk about in our report. So the group itself, we spent the better part of the last year, hosting biweekly calls, going through a 5-step process to kind of come to our recommendations. Through the process, we also had one face-to-face that we held when we were at the MOG meeting. A lot of us were at a MOG meeting together, so we had a face-to-face there. We went through the process, analyzed the stuff, identified a number of findings and best practices, and then put them together in the report. So in the findings, some of these things are not new, but what we knew part of going in was that these open resolvers weren't a new problem, but they definitely needed further attention because they've been a big problem. One thing to understand is that the DNS is actually not the problem. It's the underlying protocol that DNS uses, which is the UDP protocol. And since CSRIC 3, the attacks using open resolvers have continued and have increased, and even recently over the last year or so, there were a few that made some big headlines. One of them was the Spam House attack that came up last year. And then our group wasn't the only group looking at this at the same time. While we were working on this, the SSAC group within ICON issued an advisory report itself, and then the U.S. CERT team also issued some various reports on how to deal with open resolvers. Wonderful. Hint on small fonts. Anyway, one of the things, talked about that DNS isn't the problem. The root cause is really the UDP. It continues to be the primary vector for a lot of attacks is the IP address spoofing. And then in addition, what we also found is that there are a lot of open resolvers out there that are just unintentional. They're out there because of misconfigured DNS servers. When people install their DNS software, it historically is defaulted to operate as an open resolver or open. And similarly, a lot of the low-cost routers that people buy for their homes come with software in them, and they just come out of the box operating as open resolver. So that adds to the attack surface that's out there. And then as part of that, getting the DNS software itself, getting the updates, it hasn't been consistently applied, so it's been hard to get that all patched, even though there are known fixes in some cases. And then we also looked at some of the measurements as part of this. There are a number of projects out there that are internet community-based that look at measuring and identifying open resolvers out there. They do a pretty good job, but they need to be taken with a little bit of grain of salt. Just to you can't take the information in isolation by itself. So that's part of the finding. So the group came up with 7 recommendations that were related to the open resolvers themselves, and then one recommendation that is also jointly with the BGP subgroup. So with the BGP subgroup, we recommended that the measurement side of it be still driven from the internet community due to the borderless nature of the problem, and that to work with these groups to continue to make these things more robust and work on making sure that they measure what we're looking for. Within the group itself, we identified that there are a number of parts in the SSAC 65 alert that came from the ICON that we recommended that network service providers and ISPs follow and use as applicable. In addition, there's a number of things with the DNS servers themselves, talking about how to set them up so that you segregate them, so that your authoritative and recursive servers are separate. We made a recommendation on making sure that you configure a DNS server so that you can minimize the amount of information, so that if it is used inappropriately, you reduce the amount of information. We also made a recommendation that for the open resolvers that are identified in networks, that the ISPs work to manage those detected users operating, reach out, notify them in some form so that they know, hey, you got an open resolver, you need to do something about it. There's a couple other things on the back end on how to make sure you have your DNS server properly configured, and then there's actually an IETF RFC talking about using TCP as part of the DNS. So we recommend that providers look at using that as part of setting up their DNS servers. And then last, we made a recommendation that for the open resolvers themselves that are particularly being sold in the retail market, that the equipment providers should make it so when they ship these from the factory that they should be shipped in a manner so that they're not defaulting as an open recursive server, so that everybody doesn't have to go and figure out how to turn this off in their home. And then it should be easy to figure it out. If you went home and you tried to open up your home router and figure out if you're an open resolver, I think it would be pretty difficult. You'd have to go run some tests, and you have to know how to go do it. So part of our recommendation is make it easy so people know that they're not participating in this attack surface. And that's what we got.
Yeah, Matt.
Oh, no, I wanted to say thank you before the questions to all the people in Work Group 6 who helped put together this report. It took a lot of work, and so I wanted to say kudos to all those who helped.
Matt, great description and good solid recommendations. The DNS resolver default and getting the vendors to change that so that it's not open automatically or out of the box. Did the group contact any vendors to get a sense of how difficult that would be? And their enthusiasm for doing this?
We didn't speak directly to any vendors themselves. And,
okay.
So I can only speculate on their enthusiasm.
I think that's something we may be able to ask to meet with one or two.
I can tell you the group was a number of people were fairly vocal and passionate about the problem where it is. And so,
okay. The second question is that it sounds like what you're recommending is that the ISPs are the best position to detect where there are open resolvers among their customers and to then engage with their customers to help them either educate them to the downside of that and to help them clear that up.
So what the recommendation is to actually work with use groups such as the Shadow server. They do actually a pretty good job at identifying the open resolvers. Okay. So to leverage the internet community-based projects that are looking at the grander internet.
So you pull the data from
and
there.
Get the data from them.
ISPs will take that.
And then to use that to figure out who within their network that is actually under their control to reach out and notify them. Because within their networks, there's often people that have legitimate reasons to be having something in that state, or it's outside the control of the ISP just because it's in the ISP's address space doesn't mean the ISP necessarily is owning and operating. So it gets a little challenging sometimes.
I think we'd want to hear from the ISPs on when they have engaged in that for a period of time and then identify that, there's just 10% that because of the way that service functions that they're using the resolvers for, that right now there's not a good technical answer for not having it be open. Then there'll be another 15% that, hey, we told them 10 times and they still haven't changed. That we'd like to understand both categories and see what we can do to help.
Right. No, that would be useful. I think that within the group, one of the challenges was just how do you when they have reached out to customers, helping them figure out how to turn that off.
Expert here from Shadow Server who's going to help me understand why that's either a bad idea or why we might be able to move forward.
Can you hear me? So I think the problem is multitude. I mean, the first part is when you look at the ISP or the hosters, there's only a piece of what they control themselves, and that's what they can actually remediate, which is usually the smallest % of the total address space they have. Then you have the enterprise space, which can control their own stuff, and then you have the CPE, which is what as mentioned several times, and that's actually a large problem, where we continually see CPE being probably one of the largest affected, whether it's the actual router itself or the devices behind the router being affected. And then you also have the international issue. So in the last 12 months, we've seen the total number of open DNS resolvers reduce itself by over 3.5 million. Right? Well, that still means there's 6.5, 7 million out there. But most of those are not necessarily in the U.S. They never have been. Right? And so when you're looking at trying to solve the problem, you have to solve it. This is just one way of trying to solve it here within the U.S. It doesn't have an impact over internationally. So I mean, So we can look at the breakdowns in the future on how many there in each of these different categories, but we really have to rely on the providers themselves to help give us those numbers, because you can't always make the determination on our own. So I can do a multitude of types of scans. So DNS is just one of many. So I can do SNMP to try to do the devices, but I'm not necessarily going to get a complete overlap with each one of the different types of scans. And so when he says, it's not strong scientific rigor, well, that's really true. I mean, we'll scan every day, and we can see the differences on a day-to-day basis, and we can look at overall trending. But the tighter specifics means we need to have a tighter partnership with the providers and everyone else to figure those numbers out.
Yeah, no, that's great, and a good illustration of the global nature of this and the progress we've made here domestically, but also we really haven't solved it until we make a dent globally, which is why I think looking at some of the incentive structure and how with our ISPs we can become a better model for how this might scale around the rest of the world. And everywhere I've traveled, they really look to the solutions that we have here in the way that we manage the market as kind of the gold standard for, that's the right mix between innovation and security and privacy. So I'm looking for ways in which we can get that last, 10-20% domestically in a way that then we can work with our partners, both commercially and with, from our context here at the FCC, with our partners to help attack the global challenge.
I agree, and I think one of the methodologies of kind of doing that is to work with the CPE manufacturers, because what's going to happen is if we can get them to push a more
install it right the first time.
Well, if we can get them to install a more secure configuration now, it's not going to affect the current generation or the next generation, but maybe the third generation devices that are being bought are going to have this thing. And if it's either required or mandated at a certain point where you must have a secure configuration, then it's going to propagate out. And then as these less expensive devices get deployed, if they have to meet the same requirements, it's going to start percolating out to the internationally, because it's going to be easier for them to make one configuration, not 5. And so if we require then a more secure configuration, then maybe the 4th and 5th generation or the 6th generation device will then internationally also be more secure, which will slowly, through entropy, eliminate the problem internationally as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
All right, so since there are no other questions for Bill and his team, let's take a vote. All those in favor of approval of the recommendations, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Anyone on the phone opposed?
Aye.
All right, the recommendations are passed. Thank you.
Aye.
I think we'll just do the nay votes on the phone. So let's move along. Working Group 1 for Next Gen 911. Lori?
If we could have the slides, please. And also, Brian, are you on the line?
I am on the line.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Great. I just have one quick question for the Admiral and for others. I recognize we have a series of reports that we have to go through today, and we have a rather large slide deck. Each of these slides, once we get past the introduction, addresses questions that have been raised to the working group. And one of the things that we could do is just to make the slide deck available to everyone, because we present each question, respond to each question, and then we can skip that deck and go right to the recommendations, conclusions. Your call.
Okay. Brian, I think that would be good if maybe you could precede that with a 2-minute kind of scene setter baseline so that we all have a common appreciation of the problem. But then skipping towards the recommendations and having a discussion around that, I think, would be particularly fruitful in this area.
Laurie, is that okay with you?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Okay.
Lori, do you want to begin?
Absolutely. Thank you. And good afternoon, and thank you. If we could have I guess I moved it to the next slide. So this is Working Group 1, entitled Next Generation 911. And as you can see here, there were 4 tasks that were originally assigned to our working group. We are reporting out today, providing a final report on the final task, or at least so far, the final task to our working group. And the membership for this task was charged with questions concerning several aspects of location estimation for voice over LTE or VoLTE, including accuracy, latency, and testing. And the focus of this report is not the LCC rule compliance per se, but VoLTE's potential in terms of its usefulness in applying existing location technology testing procedures and policies to the issue of 911 caller location accuracy performance. So moving on to the next slide, the folks that were a part of this working group, there were more than 30 of them, and they really did the yeoman's job. We're trying to represent their work here today, and we thank them for everything that they have done. They worked really hard. Special thanks particularly to Jenny Hansen, who chaired this group, to Terry Brooks, who's here with us today, who was the chief author for this report. And she has also volunteered to try and answer any technical questions that may come up. I just a 10-second digression. When the engineers in the group start using terms like technically gnarly, we know that us mere mortals are going to be challenged in terms of keeping up with them. So thank you, Terry, for being here. We also would like to thank Tim May from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, who was really a part of this group. I mean, he was extremely helpful not only in providing clarification, but context and background and a lot of information that was really useful to the group. Our members included carriers, public safety, 911, local, state, and federal government folks, folks that represent the national professional organizations, folks that are involved in location information technology companies, as well as public safety consultant companies. Brian.
Brian, over to you.
Brian, are you on mute?
You know what? There you go. I was on mute. I'm trying to avoid any background noise coming over the phone. What we did is just looked at the methodology, and the methodology we used here is very similar to the methodologies used by other working groups, and that's relying on case studies, subject matter expert discussions, conference calls, lots of conference calls, in-person meetings, and each of these groups within Working Group 1 established their own time schedule for conference calls, set their test deadlines, etc. We also participated with the working group subgroup chairs once a month just to go over the progress of the working groups. We also had calls with the steering committee itself of CSRIC and established the deadlines for providing the reports that you've had previously and the report today. So the methodology was very inclusive, exhaustive in terms of phone calls, and again, this is a huge credit to all of those who participated in the working group.
Okay, thank you. So just to give you a little bit of background and context with regard to the task that this group was charged with, it really started with the work that was done in CSRIC 3. And the CSRIC 3 recommendations from Working Group 3, which included certain key performance indicators and different types of empirical testing as part of the recommended maintenance testing for location accuracy for 911 calls, specifically outdoor 911 calls. and the accuracy of the location information that is delivered with those calls. So we were asked to examine whether those recommendations still apply for network-based carriers that are configuring a voice over LTE or 4G networks. So as the networks are transitioning from 2G, 3G to 4G, we were asked to determine whether those recommendations still apply. We were asked to examine any necessary changes in the testing recommendations and recommend cost-effective measures to meet the current location accuracy parameters. And also, we were asked to examine the ability of voice over LTE configured networks to provide enhanced location capabilities, and then to consider methodologies to resolve differences in opinions on the issue of yield that was brought up in that original March 2012 report from CSRIC 3. Brian.
Thank you. Bottom line is this report documents the impact of voice over LTE or VoLTE implementation and what it will have on the carrier's ability to comply with existing wireless E911 location accuracy levels. It also documents the carrier's transitioning from 2G and 3G networks to VoLTE networks and generating and delivering location information to public safety answering points. During this period, in reality, the carriers will likely be operating multiple networks, concurrent with voice over LTE networks. And so we had examined the impact, if any, on the simultaneous operations of both VoLTE and non-VoLTE networks during the transition, and what impact this will have on the carrier's wireless location accuracy performance. Lori?
Thank you. So when we received this task, the group started to talk about it and decided to seek clarification on their task from the FCC once they really started talking about the details. And the FCC provided clarification in the form of 9 questions. And the subgroup answered those questions, and the report that was submitted basically answers those questions. The answers comprise the bulk of the report, and we believe the objectives of our group and the tasks were accomplished by answering those 9 questions. So let me fast forward through those because we have agreed that we are going to move directly to the conclusions. Okay, so
kind of like speed reading.
Response to the conclusions to you.
Okay. Again,
I'm sorry,
if anybody wants to go through each of these questions and the responses to them, we do have the slide deck, and that can be made available to everyone.
Brian, if the Admiral has a question.
Yeah.
Sure.
Brian, I didn't mean we don't want to hear the recommendations. We very much want to hear the recommendations.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we will be providing both conclusions and recommendations.
In the verbal presentation right now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, because we scrolled right past those recommendations, and I didn't get a 1.
The slides that we whipped past there were the answers to the 9 questions, and it formed the basis for the recommendations, but did not include the recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Brian, go ahead.
Okay, for those of us on the call, your microphone cuts in and out, so it's kind of hard to respond immediately to questions that you have because some of the conversation is missing or is actually impossible to hear. So we are on the conclusion slide here. So let's just go through some of the conclusions and recommendations based on the work of this working group. The net of the conclusion is that it's not anticipated that modifications to existing outdoor carrier testing methods or procedures would be required due to the introduction of VoLTE service. If specific indoor requirements are adopted in the future, and we recognize the Commission has this as an open proceeding, then we anticipate that different testing methodologies would be required, such as testing of representative indoor environments and so forth. It's premature to speculate on the specifics of indoor testing procedures in advance of the FCC's proceeding on indoor location accuracy, among other things raised in their notice. Additionally, the FCC should continue to support the recommendations of the CSRIC 3 Working Group 3 report, and it's summarized in the final report on outdoor location accuracy, and that was approved on March 14, 2012, and specifically the section 5.4.2 of that report, and it's talking specifically about proposed maintenance approach. The goal of maintenance testing is to identify a method that verifies the continued optimal performance of E911 location systems at the local level. So those were the two conclusions, if you will, that were drawn from the work of this working group, and specifically in response to the questions that were raised. And now we'll go to the recommendations of CSRIC 3, which ties into the recommendations of CSRIC 4. Laurie?
Okay, so the first recommendation of the group is that the FCC continue to support the recommendations made by the previous CSRIC, by CSRIC 3. And they are reiterated in the report as well as the slides. So there are recommendations for key performance indicators that should routinely be monitored to help identify instances where system performance has degraded. There are recommendations for other measures related to the enhancements of location technology that will be introduced with 4G, like OTDOA, and that those should be validated in representative environments to ensure equivalent or improved performance. So spot checking using empirical field testing should be conducted on a needed basis. And you can see the rest here. Empirical data for maintenance testing may be collected incrementally over time. Any significant deviations from expected prior performance levels should result in careful investigation and retesting of the applicable test area. Alternative maintenance testing methods could replace the need for full compliance testing every 2 years. And all legitimate performance inquiries from the county or the public safety answering point or other public safety entities should be properly investigated with the full cooperation from the wireless service provider and any issues resolved in a timely manner. So those are the recommendations that were made by the previous CSRIC that the group recommended that the FCC continue to support. Brian.
Great. Now we move into the recommendations of this CSRIC working group in light of all of the questions that have been raised and responses to those questions and the discussions of some of the technologies, including additional satellite systems and so forth. The net of the recommendations is that the FCC should expect over time location performance with VoLTE to be slightly better or equivalent to 2 and 3G performances. Again, this is primarily focusing on outdoor location metrics. Location expectations should be validated via a formal testing process in a VoLTE scenario. Ideally, this would encompass both outdoor and indoor environments, with both individual and hybrid location methods being validated. Again, the indoor environment testing has not been fully developed at this point in light of the outstanding proceeding at the FCC addressing indoor location accuracy. Laurie?
Okay. As we submitted our draft report, we received multiple questions from the FCC. And, you know, for the sake of brevity and sanity, we did not include all of those questions and how we adjudicated them. But suffice it to say that the group did review the report and the questions in detail, and the answers to those questions were included in the final report that was submitted to this group. So.
Brian, Laurie, thank you for the work in the report and the validation of the previous recommendations and your additional elements there. It does seem to me, though, that the dramatically faster speeds associated with LTE in the additional technical elements to make VoLTE effective drive a need for much more accurate timing standards than in slower speed networks, certainly than 2G, 3G, and that inherently the faster, the more accurate timing standards should very much be translatable into dramatically improved OTDOA than is possible in the lower speed networks. So the comment that location accuracy would be potentially slightly better with VoLTE over voice in the older networks, I'm not sure I completely understand that. And it also strikes me that if OTDOA is suddenly possible in a broadly scalable way, that because of the nature in which it's derived, it kind of makes the indoor-outdoor question moot, or at least less significant. Can anybody from the group talk about whether or not we reach an inflection point, a tipping point, as we go to VoLTE that would suggest that the timing standard is now sufficient to ensure that an accurate OTDOA to the standards we've discussed before?
Thank you for your question. Okay, first let me address what you had started with when you were saying that we have everything is faster in LTE. That is correct. We do have faster data. That has to do more with the air interface, and I believe that the reason that the group felt that it was appropriate to say there might just be a modest improvement with the rollover to LTE is really that what you're looking at there is the messaging that's passing between the network nodes, and your latency is not necessarily going to be decreased much within that messaging. We do still have to pass that information between the nodes for these calculations to take place. And based on that dependency rolling to LTE, we're not going to see much of a change. With concerns with OTDOA, and I am certainly not an expert on OTDOA, I do understand from the group discussion that, yes, there are finer timing mechanisms, and we may see some improvements there, more improvements to maybe accuracy, especially I think that was also mentioned specifically for GPS, that we may see some modest improvements there. But once again, OTDOA is not my specialty, so I really can't go in depth there.
Okay, maybe we can do a follow-up later with the industry on the relationship between the faster timing standards and the ability for OTDA to be practical at scale. Thanks.
Any other questions for the team in the room? Anyone on the bridge have questions? All right, so we'll vote. All those in favor of approval of the recommendations, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Anyone on the bridge opposed, nay. All right, the recommendations passed. Thank you very much. Next up, Working Group 5. Server-based DDoS attacks recommendations. I think Mike Glenn is going to do that.
Yes, you're right.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you. So this is the final report of Working Group 5, which was the remediation of server-based DDoS attacks. Many things that you'll see in the report we presented already previously, so I might scan over some of them. If you have questions, please let me know. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Oh. So, our description and charter was to make recommendations to the Council regarding network-level best practices and other measures to mitigate the effects of DDoS attacks, specifically around large hosting centers and data centers. We had a wide representation from industry on the committee that I've gone over before, and some very good discussion. I do want to take just a moment to acknowledge a few people who put in tremendous amount of work. Jared Allison and Chris Boyer with Verizon and AT&T, John Denning with Bank of America, Earl Weiss with the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, Roland Dobbins from Arbor, who led our subgroups and developed the case studies that are in the reports for actual attacks that went on so we could study those. Of course, our FCC liaison, Vern Mosley, who was a tremendous help. One of our editors, Paul Diamond, for really pulling this report together. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Peter Fonash, for his wisdom and leadership. And lastly, Bob Thornberry, that the Admiral called out, who helped under significant, personal hardship and really contributed substantially to this report. So I specifically want to call out Bob. And thank you for everyone's work, all of the committee members and working group members. Just a summary from our last report. We had our final face-to-face in Arlington, Virginia, where we really worked on the best practices recommendations from the last draft report that we presented to this council, and we delivered our final report earlier this week, or last week, I guess. Here's the report itself, just a couple items of note. We did include a section on metrics, and very specifically around metrics. We wanted to give that particular section the diligence that it needed, and so we worked with Working Group 4 in order to develop a framework around metrics that then we would leverage to help develop better DDoS metrics for that. And so we feel that that's the best way to approach the problem, and that's how we've addressed metrics. We also added barriers to participation around some of the recommendations. The approach, just as a reminder of how we approach the problem, we developed subgroups from both the ISPs, the financial community, internet security experts, and then a best practice working group to develop and study actual attacks that went on. Those are documented within the report, so we could have our recommendations would be relevant and practical. We had biweekly and weekly meetings and 3 face-to-face meetings to generate it. And we did look at a variety of existing best practices. We went over 600 to 700 existing best practices, both within CSRIC and within the industry. We did a gap analysis. The intent originally, some of the people wanted to develop, the 5 best practices that would address the problem, right? If you just do these 5, then you'll substantially solve the problem. What actually happened is it's a very complex problem set. We have a taxonomy in the report that shows the difficulty. As Working Group 6, presented, they looked at open DNS resolvers, which is one aspect of the problem we were looking at, right? So it's a very complex problem. And in the end, we narrowed our recommendations down to 50 best practices among 3 sets of responsible parties: network operators, hosting providers, and then targets or victims. And so we tried to narrow our recommendations down in those categories. We also took the recommendations and broke them down into an incident response model. I presented this the last time. We leveraged and modified some the Arbor model, which is based on a standard incident response model around preparation, identification, classification, traceback, reaction, and postmortem. We then map those into the NIST cybersecurity framework, because the incident response model is really just a subset of the broader NIST cybersecurity framework. And we tried to categorize the best practices that way so you could look at them from those perspectives so they weren't so overwhelming. In the actual best practices, here's kind of a breakdown by numbers of the best practices by category, so you can see it's pretty small print, I realize, but we have network operators, hosting providers, and then targets. We have 25 recommendations across those 6 phases for network operators. We have 17 recommendations, some of which are duplicate for hosting providers. And then we have 8 recommendations for the victims or the targets. Because it's a shared ecosystem, there's not, a one-size-fits-all within this space. And everyone has to contribute to effectively, prevent and mitigate this particular problem. We also then ranked those by what the committee members felt, or the working group members felt, were the effectiveness from a high, medium, and low perspective. And then we also rated those recommendations by an implementation difficulty. Now, what we're really hoping for is that sweet spot around, here's the 10 recommendations that are highly effective and they're really easy to do. And what we found is they don't really exist, right? This is a really hard space, or I wouldn't be standing in front of you, right? And so you'll see that, a lot of them are hard to implement, right? And that's kind of the way the way the problem shakes out. It is what it is. So the key findings that we have, these are the same key findings from the last report that I presented. I'm not going to go into detail because I went into detail the last time in this, so there's no changes to the findings that we have. Unless there are questions, I'll just skip over the key findings. I went over those the last time. We have 16 key findings. The conclusions really are around, we've documented our particular findings, and we've made our recommendations in the report on how to try to address these problems. The main conclusion of the report, is that this is an internet ecosystem and action needs to be taken by all members of the ecosystem. It's not going to be solved by just one member. It's also not going to be solved in one country, right? So it's a global problem across the entire ecosystem. So let me jump then to the recommendations here. Again, these are mostly the same that we made before, a couple minor changes, but of course, the first one is we would encourage recommend the FCC encourage ISPs, hosting providers, network operators to implement these voluntary recommendations in a prioritized fashion, and we attempted to prioritize those, for the people who have to implement those. The second recommendation is we would ask the FCC to encourage the best practice of best practices for hosting providers. Now, many times a network operator is also a hosting provider. That's not always the case. Sometimes that's the case, but we think we would encourage a group to develop even a more comprehensive list of best practices for those hosting providers. We have included our recommendations for hosting providers that might be used, as a starting point for that. The third recommendation is we would encourage the FCC to continue to have voluntary private sector relationships that don't already exist, and to encourage those around both sharing of information about the effectiveness around best practices and what works and what doesn't, along with collaboration on mitigation within those. A lot of that exists today, but it can be further enhanced. The fourth one is we recommend the FCC encourage the development of a voluntary clearinghouse, for DDoS mitigation, information and sharing of that in a real-time manner. As I was thinking through this recommendation, though, I did want to point out something, that as you automate things and you make things more real-time, you increase the risk of collateral damage when you don't have humans involved to look at it. And so care has to be taken on the quality of the information that goes into that and the screening, so that if you're mitigating in real time, you aren't accidentally blocking traffic from legitimate sources that may knowingly or unknowingly, their systems may be participating in the traffic, and understand the effect that might have on different organizations globally. So as we move here, the risk of that will increase as we mitigate these attacks in more real time. Fifth recommendation is around encouraging the stakeholders to share information in a standardized, structured manner, such as the DHS sticks format, or a similar type of format that would allow standardization around the sharing of that between automated systems to help improve the efficiency of the sharing of that information. That's largely done through humans, through email today, and that can certainly be improved. And then, of course, for the FCC to encourage the sharing of best practices, threat and vulnerability, and incident response actions among the specific network operators in the ComISAC. So with that, I'm not going to go through the 50 best practices and bore you today, but if there are specific questions that I could answer, I'll open it up for questions. Richard, yes.
Hello. First, I have to say I think it's a wonderful document. You've done research on a huge amount of material related to DDoSes, and for research purposes, the document, I think, fills a lot of needs and roles to tie everything together for people. You and I had a discussion prior to the meetings because I had some concerns related to the document before we came in here. I think through your discussion here, and I think you've changed probably a little bit of the wording to encompass more what we've talked about making this a larger ecosystem that you were already planning on, but also about this is not just the original plan, which was make sure you're not a participant, but also the fact that those are the targets, the recipients, the participants, all of it together, which I think is a very good thing, which I think allays a lot of the concerns that I had. So I have to say thank you for that. The one thing I didn't see in there was on your best practices is a configuration management, because a lot of the issues we see with the amplification attacks is the misconfigured services. Right? You dealt with a lot of how to configure the networks for defensive purposes and those things, but not necessarily ensuring that the devices you have are properly configured so they can't be abused. But beyond that, I would say I'm actually far happier with the document than I was maybe however many hours ago before we started.
That's good to hear.
Mostly because I think our conversation helped clean those things out. So it's just a few things here and there. I mean, I would have liked to have seen more summary points in the document to show, here's what's going on. I still have the concern related to the fact that quite a few of the recommendations are very difficult to deploy according to your document, and the concern is in producing the document and then having an engineer try to deploy it will be very. You're just going to say, hey, what do you want to deploy? Well, we'll deploy the low-hanging fruit. There are 2 lows, there are 4 or 5 mediums, and then a lot of highs. And so it's kind of I'm not sure what a good answer is in trying to present it to an organization and say, we would like you to implement these types of things when the majority of the things you want them to implement are very difficult.
That's a valid criticism, and it is a difficult problem. I actually do appreciate your comment on the configuration management, because that is a point. We did, one of the problems was around software in hosting providers, right, being out of date or having security patches or problems. They either weren't supported anymore. And so one of the recommendations, it doesn't deal specifically with yours, right, but one of the recommendations we have in there is around hosting providers ensuring that they provide their customers with supported add-ins, specifically plugins on a lot of the open source web servers and publishing software that's out there. There are tens of thousands of plugins in those particular systems, and we actually invited those open source groups to participate. We got some early participation, but unfortunately they dropped out. But the point is, people will write a plugin for a particular publishing system, such as WordPress or whatever, and then there are significant vulnerabilities in that, and no one is there to support it. And so that's where we see a lot of the malware being deposited and leveraged within the ecosystem.
I agree when you talk about malware, but you actually have basic configurations of even the network devices themselves. So we come back to the conversation from earlier today about CPE.
And I would agree with you.
And you've got the routers and the switches, the core routers and switches. I mean, we've seen core routers get compromised because they have default passwords, right. And then suddenly, you've got some criminal organization have a core BGP router who can then manipulate routes. So there's or amplification attacks, and so I think it's more inclusive than just the hosting providers. I think the ISPs have a role in it as well to ensure that they're configuring their devices, making sure they're not dual homing between networks they weren't concerned about. Because we've seen that with some of the scans that we do, where packets will go in one part of the network and come out of the other,
right.
And they go, well, how did that happen, right? We have our stuff configured correctly, and it turns out there's DNS forwarding chains or SNMP chains that exist they weren't aware of, and so I think there's a portion of that related to the DDoSes that can occur, because if you're aware of any of those issues, you can exploit them and cause a down of an ISP by exploiting their misconfigurations as well.
Yeah, and that actually raises a point that we struggle with within the group that I should raise, and that is, with all the best practices, as we were going through there's a reason why there's 600 or 700 best practices, and a lot of those you can say, gosh, if people did this, that would help the security of the internet, and it might help the DDoS problem, right? But we made a conscious effort to exclude those from our report very specifically, because what we found is if we included all those, our report would have had 600 best practices, and the problem that you stated earlier about which ones do you address first would be obscured on where do I even start, and people felt overwhelmed. I can tell you from doing this report initially, when we started going through the best practices, we were just blurry-eyed going, okay, which ones are important, and we took an approach to only try to include the most important ones, right? And actually, I remember this discussion now, so I appreciate it, because we had that discussion around configuration management, and is that a best practice that everyone should follow in general for internet security? And we excluded that specifically as a result of that, because we threw that in the broader category of that's a good thing to do in general for any machine, right? Whether it's participating in a DDoS attack or not, or whether it's involved in the theft of company data or personal data. That's a best practice that should be held regardless. It's not specific to DDoS, but I do appreciate.
It's just when I look at the DDoSes in the news today, right? They're usually amplification attacks and usually UDP amplification, and it occurs mostly for one of two reasons. It's because anti-spoofing is not in place at ISP level, and the devices are misconfigured, right? Which is why I kind of call that one out a little further ahead, because the misconfiguration brings it much forward. And there's a long discussion about a lot of these kinds of things, because you can look at the SNMP, where I can then derive information about the devices, the operating system, the firmware, and know the vulnerabilities of the device itself. I can look at some of the protocols, some of the self-discovery protocols, where I can then probe it and actually have it hand back the network infrastructure that's hiding behind it, therefore giving me intelligence for secondary attacks, which is beyond some of the DDoS stuff, but it's much more, inclusive, I think, in some of what you're looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you raised, Richard. In fact, an opportunity here. And while I agree with adding the addition of every possible configuration element into the report would not have been necessarily useful in the report, the idea that there's really a fourth element here, NetOps, the hosting provider, and targets and victims, but the individuals or companies that actually do the provisioning of a server have a very positive role to play here. If we can kind of look at that part of the process and ensure that best practices are employed there. One of the things we did in Job Last, as we sought to automate the provisioning process of servers, was to, as much as possible, script our final verification that many of the configuration settings that would otherwise generate insecurities were detectable in that script that ran as part of the provisioning process. And things as simple as, is the sysad processor still admin? But really, I think many more of the more involved configuration elements that you described, if that were to become more standard, that kind of a practice, whether it was automated as a script or semi-manual, I think not only would that catch many things that you described, but potentially, if in fact that script included a scoring that said if there was a configuration that the industry determined that configuration leads to a high probability that DDoS, that device would be subject to DDoS application attacks, that there may be a different pricing structure. If the customer that says, I insist on configuring in that way and running in your ISP, if you can link that to a higher probability of that being the thing that created a unmanageable DDoS problem in the future, I'd encourage the ISPs to look at that aspect of this. Did I understand that right, Richard? I'd also like to ask Michael, you described I'm sorry. Let's go to Brian's question. Yeah.
Oh, excuse me.
Question. So when you said that this is a subset of all the best practices, you mentioned 600 or something like that. Is that somewhere? So if somebody wanted to see what the best practices universe is, to be able to look at that, is that collected somewhere that somebody could then, as you've already identified what you think are the best recommendations, other recommendations that they can look at to understand and do research in that area?
Not all in one document. We have some of our original documents. So we looked at CSRIC, we looked at IETF, we looked in a number of different areas to pull in the relevant items. And the areas that we looked at are in the report, but we don't have listed all of the best practices. In addition, I might point out we modified a number of existing CSRIC best practices from their original wording to make them either more relevant or applicable to our problem space. And what we tried to do was be careful, though, understanding the context that those best practices might apply to a larger universe of problems, right, than just DDoS. And so we tried to be careful not to remove some of the original intent of the best practice that was out there, but to ensure that it met the benefit, the requirements for DDoS mitigation or prevention. To answer your question, though, we don't have a complete list published of those best practices.
Brian, the CSRIC best practices are publicly available. It sounds like, Mike, you may be using some things from other sources like IETF and so forth. Those are not part of the CSRIC
Right. All of those.
It might be helpful for whatever you've looked at across the board, since you've at least identified those as best practices that you should have at least considered. You may not have put them in the report, but it was something you at least gave some kind of threshold that they passed. To be able to put those all together so that academics or firms could then say, well, here's a universe of things I should be looking at, whether they're actually recommendations from here or not. They'll at least be out there, so that could be a piece of the knowledge base that people can build from.
The majority of the best practices we looked at were from the CSRIC database that are published. In addition, we pulled in, all of the information that we have, is publicly available. So nothing came.
No, I'm saying, yeah, but it's
all
not, over the place, right?
It's not put together.
I think we can pull this together.
Yeah.
If there were best practices that were not a part of the CSRIC report to us, but were referenced in the work, then we'll put them on our website and we'll make sure they're linkable.
Yeah.
I do want to point out just one other thing real quick, if you don't mind, and that is we do have 18 new best practices, some of which were documented, some of which were not, but based on, operators' experience, based on victims' experience, right, that we put together within it to demonstrate practices, many of which have been done for the past 5-10 years, right? But to try to clearly document those of what we were doing where there wasn't a clear reference in the past.
And all that knowledge, we're just saying, could probably be helpful, be useful for others who at least you've already looked at some extent and they could build off of that going forward. I hate to lose what you've already done, the good work.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Michael, on the central clearinghouse for DDoS mitigation, you mentioned doing that within the DHS structure, the context of that. Would that be naturally done best in the ComISAC that's located within the NCAC, or should there be commercial ISACs or equivalents that are maybe federated at a lower level between companies that then feed up to the ComISAC? Right now, the ComISAC isn't plumbed to do some of the automated things that you described, and I'm trying to get my head around the practical implementation of what you've offered here vis-a-vis the existing ComISAC.
Yeah, so I want to be clear. The recommendation is not within the ComISAC, right, but cross-sector coordination, which we felt might be best done at DHS. We had that discussion prior to this meeting, Admiral, around, is it more appropriate to have a neutral non-government entity do that, and that could be a consideration also. But the idea would be, for example, if a company in retail comes under DDoS attack, they have a known place to report it and to try to get assistance rather than where do I go, right? And then to have a central coordination agency or group or organization to help consolidate that information, sanitize the information, ensure privacy concerns around the information, but at the same time then be able to distribute that information to the parties who can most effectively mitigate the attack and assist within that. And some of that, this is an interesting topic because some of those areas will be, you help your customer, but there are different levels of services as you described before, right? And so depending upon a particular entity's needs around availability and uptime and other things, they may have more extensive mitigations from either their ISP or a third-party DDoS mitigation than other companies who decide not to purchase those services. And so there will be different levels of mitigation around DDoS attacks, just like they are today. But the idea would be a central coordinated clearinghouse where people can go to report DDoS attacks. You can also go to help mitigate and clean up the endpoints that are infected, whether those are in hosting centers or enterprises or government agencies, for that matter, right, or residential home computers, where you can then notify a party to help clean up or at least notify the end user that they have a problem and they need to take action, right?
While I think it's useful to and appropriate to do it underneath the DHS construct, I think the exchange that you're talking about in all the cases except for where the government is the consumer organization, where that's private to private, consumer to provider, that strikes me as being much more clean without additional layers in it. So I'll give you an example using the FS-ISAC. If a bank sees a DDoS attack and they share with the FS-ISAC, private organization, that, boy, this is attacking us, and the FS-ISAC determines that, well, it's probably an issue we're all concerned about, that the FS-ISAC be able to engage in a machine-to-machine way with the COM-ISAC.
And that was the intent.
Okay.
That actually is the intent and why we called out DHS, so that you might have a higher level coordinating center from all the different ISACs, the COM-ISAC, the FS-ISAC, the water ISAC, right, the energy ISACs, oil and gas, where companies have the ability to have a central reporting area to go, and mitigators, whether that's the actual mitigation of the attack in real time or the cleanup of infected devices after, have a central place to go that knows that I can get feeds, right, and information from this, and the victims know about it. Now, whether that's more appropriate at the government level or in private industry, I think that should be considered. What might be most effective?
Coordination often means that the coordinating party has to say yes before you do. And if you're waiting for government to say yes before the attack says, please do this on my behalf to stop the attack, I think you're setting up the wrong process. That government being able to observe what's happening and, in fact, contribute intelligence and the potentially useful coordination from other sectors would be great, but please don't put us in the middle of your detect and respond function.
No, and I think it was more of a place not to give the go-ahead that, when we ask you, you'll do this, but to be able to have a collaboration center between those entities.
Some kind of clearinghouse is needed where the people can come to, but I completely disagree about housing it anywhere within the government. I think this is definitely, you need a neutral third party, because you're going to have a lot of organizations that are already nervous working with the government, and they're going to be sharing this sensitive information and concerned about where it goes. By having a neutral third party, no matter what it is, a new organization or an old organization, you can already have a better trust level. And then what's pertinent to the government can be given to the government. I think you'll add a huge amount of bureaucracy and requirements that most of the vendors who may provide data are not willing to jump through the hoops for. So I think it's a great idea, and I absolutely agree with everything you say, except for the part about housing it within the government anywhere. I think you can make something or use something that's already in existence that can do the communication. You can build the structures with the different ISACs and everything else without having to add that extra burden to it.
Fair criticism. Thank you.
Good, and that really leads to my last point that I'd like to offer is that if we look at the new paradigm that we've offered here and that we're all together building, what is the role of the FCC if we're not busy creating prescriptive rules and regulations? I think the most powerful thing that we can do contribute to this in the regulatory vein is to convene, because we've got this wonderful convening authority to be able to bring together some of the elements of the ecosystem here, the network operators, the hosting providers, representatives of the target and victim organizations. And so I offer that and would then include and how do we further connect with those internationally. That I think we will want to continue to work with the CSRIC, with this CSRIC group, to take a couple of use cases and really work them through what has to be done to get just that the kind of DDoS mitigation that you've described in your report done in a couple of specific use cases. We'd love to identify the barriers associated with that, figure out how to mitigate those barriers, and actually move forward, get that ball out of the red zone and across the goal line on a couple of examples of what you've offered.
Yeah, and I might point out, some of that activity is going on today, and I want to point out specifically Shadow Server. They were mentioned before. They act as a great coordination center, especially around for us, for CenturyLink, as an ISP, around distributing information from different organizations that they either their own information or information they gather from other parties in a high quality standardized format, right? And that goes on. I think what's missing here, though, is that a lot of the end victim users don't know about Shadow Server, right? If you're an ISP, you know about Shadow Server. If you're in this area, you know about them. But the average community bank probably does not know. They may know, but may not know who Shadow Server is, right? And so the idea is that, again, that centralized clearinghouse that can be neutral and effective in that coordinating and collaboration area. Not I don't think we're as hung up on exactly where it goes as long as the function occurs.
Yeah, great. So I think we can help with that with our partners across the regulatory landscape to advance this voluntary structure that we're talking about that says, okay, FS-ISAC, Energy ISACs, other ISACs, let's introduce you to the how that effective identification of the onset of a DDoS attack and the satisfying mitigation in the communication sector can more be addressed in a much more satisfying manner than it has in the past. That's the kind of convening that I'm talking about, to bring those other sector players into the discussion.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Mike? Anyone on the phone have questions? All right, let's put it to a vote. All those in favor of approval, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Anyone on the phone opposed, say nay. All right, it's passed. Thanks, Mike. All right, so I have quarter after right now, so let's take a quick break. Come back at, let's just do 5 minutes, 20 after the hour, and we'll wrap it up. We got 2 more reports and recommendations, and then readouts from the rest of the teams. We've got Working Group 7. Robin Howard is going to do a readout for Working Group 7.
Infusions.
That's working. Hey, Robin, you on the bridge? Is Robin supposed to?
Yes, I'm here, Jeff.
Okay. Off you go.
Okay, just waiting to see the deck come up, and then I'll get started. Okay. All right, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased today to provide Working Group 7's final report for Legacy Network Best Practices. I would like to thank all the Working Group 7 team members and our FCC liaison, Jerry Stanshine, who have provided so much time and effort into completing our report, and a special thank you to our sub-team leads for providing their expert leadership throughout the process. So I'll go on to slide 2. Slide 2 provides Working Group 7's current charter. Our original charter included a total of 4 items addressing legacy best practices that was eventually expanded to include a 5th item to address manhole security. Next slide, please. In March of this year, Working Group 7 completed and presented to Council a report on manhole security. Today, we are completing and providing a readout and final report on 3 additional items related to legacy best practices. Our final charter item is due in March of 2015, which the working group will be addressing in the coming months. Next slide, please. Working Group 7 currently consists of 15 subject matter experts listed on this slide. We have substantial expertise on best practice processes and best practice structure, which was invaluable to completing our work on the final report that we're presenting to you today. Next slide. Working Group 7's work is based on existing best practices, and to focus our efforts, we developed 4 objectives for this part of our work. First was to identify a subset of best practices to be studied for legacy, reliability, and resiliency applications. Second, a review and begin modification of that subset of best practices with a focus on changes in technology, practices, or observed reliability trends. Third, we would document our changes, deletion, and new best practice recommendations. And finally, we would review and incorporate best practice recommendations made by the Alliance for Telecommunication Industry Solutions organization into the wider body of best practices. Next, please. The scope of Working Group 7 was focused on legacy networks, systems and processes, and excluded best practices related specifically to cybersecurity and public safety. In total, we identified 476 of the 1,022 current best practices as our workload. We addressed 275 best practices on network reliability and interoperability, 25 on disaster recovery and mutual aid, and 176 on physical security. It's important to reinforce that although implementation of best practices is highly recommended, best practices are voluntary in nature and may not apply in every situation due to the need for flexibility, innovation, and control in the management of different carriers' unique business models, cost, feasibility, resource limitations, or other factors. Next slide, please. On this slide, we demonstrate that a best practice has 2 key building blocks, the wording and the references. These 2 building blocks are then supported by additional elements that assist the user in finding and applying the best practices. There are 4 supporting elements that provide this search and assist process. They are the network type, industry role, status, and keywords. It is necessary to address each best practice on its entire structure, that being the wording, references, and the supporting elements, to achieve consistency in the review process. Next slide. Working Group 7 created an 11-point checklist that was used to ensure a consistent and repeatable process across our 4 sub-teams that we established to review our 476 best practices. The checklist ensured that the entire best practice structure was addressed on each review, which allows our recommendations to be more efficiently and quickly delivered to the FCC to be input into online databases for industry's use. Next slide, please. Our methodology was based on this particular flow chart, which you can also find in our final report, and it provided our 4 sub-teams decision checkpoints regarding each best practice. The checkpoints then led to deeper evaluations and discussions on the best practices. It led to gap analysis, new best practice or deletion recommendations, or in some cases we actually found that the best practice was up to date and it didn't require any changes at all. Next, please. Working Group 7 identified several findings which can be found in more detail in our final report. However, I'll summarize here. We assessed a total of 1,022 critical, highly important, and important best practices, identified 476 of those as in scope, and excluded a total of 18 of the 476 as out of scope based on a further review. 22 best practices were identified for retirement that were no longer relevant, were duplicated, or became obsolete by modification of another best practice. And we identified 396 best practices that needed modification or restructuring, with 40 best practices being up to date, and we made no changes at all. Next, please. We also found that certain aspects of best practice structure needed addressed. The first thing we did was look at the best practice taglines. A tagline is a short 3 to 5 word introduction found on many, but not all best practices. We found that due to the lack of consistency of taglines, and because existing search engines on the FCC and ADIS databases provide more than adequate search options, we concluded that they added no value and should be discontinued. Second, we realized early on that the new public safety industry role that was introduced in CSRIC 3 was applicable on many of the legacy best practices that we reviewed. So where relevant, this industry role was added into the best practice in light of the fact that many public safety organizations maintain their own communication networks. And then third, we discovered a number of best practices where information in the wording of the best practice was better suited as a reference, and we found the effectiveness or the intent of the best practice was not altered if we moved that wording into the reference section. So wherever appropriate, we moved wording for standard documents, pay-for documents, and web links into the best practice reference section. Next slide, please. Working Group 7 then identified 4 gaps that we recommend be addressed in a future CSRIC. First, the development of a best practice creation guide. We believe that the development and editing of best practices for the purpose of having the greatest value for industry should be done in a highly, tightly controlled and constant manner. Second, best practice overlap. We identified a gap that there is ongoing risk that multiple working groups during a CSRIC may unintentionally choose to edit the same best practices or create similar best practices in parallel, resulting in an uncoordinated change between working groups that actually could come into conflict within the various final reports. Third, a gap regarding for-purchase documents. We concluded that best practices should not contain references or advertised documents that a user must pay for as a condition of implementing the best practice. We made every effort to move occurrences of pay-for documents to the best practice reference section, and then we reclassified those as examples of available documents. And fourth, we address a gap for non-core best practices. During our review, we identified a number of best practices that did not clearly support the underlying theme of addressing reliability, security, or interoperability issues. We determined that these non-core best practices should be actively searched out, reviewed, and retired if necessary. Next, please. On the next 2 slides, I'm going to provide a summary of the 8 recommendations that are found in more detail in our final report. Number 1, we recommend that the best practice edits outlined in Appendix 1 of our final report be adopted and approved by Council today. That was the bulk of our work. 2, we recommend that the FCC establish a best practice clearinghouse function for all future CSRICs. 3, we recommend that the use of best practice taglines be permanently eliminated and be removed from all remaining best practices. 4, we recommend that a future CSRIC be tasked with the creation of a documented process that outlines a consistent and standard process for best practice creation and modification. 5, we recommend that the FCC promote this process used to develop the best practices as part of a best practice educational effort. Next slide, please. 6, we recommend that a future CSRIC address the issue of pay-for documents referenced in best practice verbiage and have that removed and moved to reference section if necessary. 7, we recommend that a future CSRIC consider reviewing all best practices to identify those that do not meet the core definition of clearly supporting the reliability, security, or interoperability of the communication network. And then finally, our 8th recommendation is that we recommend that a future CSRIC consider chartering a working group to revisit all the best practices that deal with locating buried facilities and reconcile those with current 811 programs, including suggestions for collaboration with other industries. Moving on to the next slide, please. So in conclusion, several recommendations have been presented in our final report that improve on best practices in the best practice process. We believe that ongoing creation and periodic expert reviews should be held to the highest standards possible to ensure the greatest value to industry. Consistency in best practice creation and editing guidelines are paramount to their continued adoption. Best practices that do not measure up to these strict quality guidelines should be reconsidered, modified if possible, or deleted if necessary. So in summary, Working Group 7 in our final report reviewed over 470 best practices and provided edits to modernize and refresh based on changes in technology, practices, or observed reliability trends. We created 4 new best practices to address either new classes of problems or to divide existing best practices into multiple individual focused best practices. We updated 1 new NRSC, which would be ADIS NRSC recommended best practice with supporting elements for approval. We recommend the deletion or retirement of 22 best practices found to be no longer relevant or needed. And we developed recommendations and proposals intended to provide ongoing guidance to future CSRICs and external parties in maintaining a quality process and consistency regarding best practices. And I have one final slide, and this would be our next steps. Working Group 7's next steps will be to address best practices in the status categories of critical, highly important, and recommend revisions to these prioritizations based on work completed by CSRIC 2 by Working Group 6. And we have a targeted completion date for that work and that final report in March of 2015. So at this time, Jeff, I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions.
Any questions for Robin?
I'd just like to thank Robin and the team that worked on this. This is very important work, and when you look at the number of 476 practices and over 1,000 in the larger category, significant work, and we appreciate the diligence that was applied to this. A quick question, Robin. For purchase best practice documents that were removed, did they leave any gaps in a best practice being implementable that you weren't able to fill sufficiently with other documents?
No, actually, I don't believe so. When we moved the pay-for documents, we actually just moved those to the reference section that's available to the person looking at the best practice. Those are still there. They're still referenced. However, we're taking it out of the actual wording of the best practice, and then the pay-for document then becomes one of many different documents that could be used by the person trying to implement the best practice.
Could be, but
So
not
there's still
required to
reference.
use. Is that right? Could be, but not required to use?
It could be, correct. There could be alternate documents available, not just that one.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Any questions on the phone? Okay, let's put the recommendation to a vote. All those in favor of approval, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Anyone on the phone opposed? All right, recommendations passed. Thank you. Lastly, today we have one more report from Tim Walden, Working Group 10, on CPE powering. Tim?
Thank you. Do we have the remote? Oh, there.
We can advance the slides from me up here, Tim, if you want. If you'd rather, if you want to sit there, we can advance the slides.
Or just say next slide, we'll do it.
Well, we can do it. Okay, good. Well, thank you. I want to share with the team today the final report that we have out of Working Group 10. And just to remind the group of the team charter, obviously with the rapid adoption of voice technologies, there's been considerable replacement and substitution of legacy telecommunication, specifically voice services as we know them today, with voice over IP solutions. As we've migrated this direction from a service perspective, it actually is taking us from an environment where voice was protected based on network-based power into a more localized power environment. And really what this working group was chartered to do is to look at those technical solutions, come back both with solution to battery backup and resiliency, as well as a communication effort as it relates to the end user. So what we did is we broke this up into two specific deliverables, the first being really a customer and consumer education and outreach component. What do we need to do to educate basically the end user of what the service is? Because many didn't realize that there had actually been a transition. So relative to that, we had Working Group 10A. Marty Kinder had she shared that report with the group last meeting. And then the second, the 10B, is basically looking at both use cases and best practices as we think about how do we improve the resiliency as we think about VoIP going forward in the future, as well as what we can do today. So let's go to the next slide. So if you look at the team here relative to Working Group 10, it's a small but what I call mighty group. Was very, very pleased with the diversity that we had from both service providers, public policy, and consumer-related consumer advocacy groups. So again, we had a very good group of individuals that brought a very diverse mindset and thought leadership to the challenge that we had at hand. A couple of individuals that I do want to call out, Marty Kinder, the council met last meeting, and Lois Burns, they led and facilitated the work around the outreach and the education component. Dave Russell with Calix Corporation was the facilitator and led the team specific to the use cases and the technical aspects. Brian Allen was the co-chair. He provided leadership and facilitation to the collective team and helped me through the task. And last but not least, John Healy, our FCC liaison, that up to now has kept us out of the penalty box, and we thank him for his efforts there as well. Next slide. Just some background and evaluation criteria that the team used. I mean, obviously, voice is migrating and migrated from a simple dedicated network to an application, and that's what we're dealing with here. I mean, TDM voice was one that, again, very simple in nature, a lot of copper infrastructure, line powering, very centralized in nature, and it basically distributed communication and communication voice application to the end user in a very simple manner. As we move to voice over IP, we go from a connection-oriented environment to a connectionless-oriented environment, and it brings a lot of complexity. And as we think about how do we want to keep that good flexibility and lifestyle services that our customers and end users want, but how do we do it in an environment that we can predict the reliability aspect of that? So, that's in itself kind of the foundational problem statement that the team had to deal with. VoIP also introduced an interworking of various technical solutions. It mixed consumer electronics, network, service, and application providers. And that's important. Network providers, service providers, and application providers. And you'll see in a minute when we go through here why that's so important to understand as we work through to try to deal with the issues at hand and how do we improve the reliability than what some of the end users are seeing today. I talked about the evolution from network-based power to localized power. I mean, again, a lot of reasons for that, a lot of benefits that the industry has gained and the network has gained by being able to do this, specifically as we think about bandwidth, flexibility, interworking, and just basically being able to go from a connection-oriented environment to a connectionless-oriented environment. Localized power is required, and it requires a much different thought process for us to be able to maintain the reliability. And very much the reliability, kind of to the education component, is going to be shared as you think through the solutions moving forward. Battery backup from a service perspective is increasingly being offered as an option. The life cycle and maintenance of UPSs and batteries are complicated, so as you move that to a localized power environment, Aunt Martha may not understand exactly what this is in her garage and what these flashing lights or non-flashing lights are doing or not doing. There is a desire and need for the solution to deal with backup in extended power environments. Superstorms are typically defined by where you sit in the geography. Being from Louisiana, Katrina and Rita was a superstorm. If you move up north, Sandy was a superstorm. Nevertheless, it created long extended power outages that we've got to think through, and how do we maintain and how do we provide that service transparency and service continuity in these events. So again, basically the approach that the working group took was to look at how are these services deployed today, taking into consideration network providers, service providers, and application providers, and come up with a given set of use cases, and then worked kind of backwards from that to say, how would we solve for each of these use cases? So the next page really kind of provides just, again, a summary to the council associated with what those use cases are. Came up with 9 use cases. These 9 use cases aren't implying an all-inclusive list, because, again, you could easily be 90 or you could easily be 900 depending on what levels of CPE you move in or out of the configurations. What this does do is provide you a good foundation of a baseline infrastructure and how individual solutions are put into the marketplace. And I think this probably covers 90+% or 95% of the applications that we see in the environment today. Just to summarize, because we've got a number of acronyms out there, ATA, that's your analog telephone adapter. And this is primarily what we're trying to solve for as we think about local powering and battery backup for VoIP. How are we dealing with this ATA environment inside the home and maintaining a level of resiliency and redundancy as we move forward? Won't read each and every one of the use cases, but just to kind of give you some flavor. The ATA function of inside the network device, think about this as you've got a broadband connection. Broadband connections coming into the home to a network device, whether that device be a router, DSL modem, etc. There's an RJ11 jack from that device to the phone, providing ring voltage, etc. That ATA is typically locally powered via an AC to DC converter. It provides both ring voltage as well as your local networking. All the way through environments where you've got cellular handsets and femto cells that are feeding back into the network via Ethernet. So again, 9 very specific use cases, and as you can think about each of those, and when the team was working through in the recommendations and best practices, we wound up with 29 individual recommendations and best practices as we worked through that. So let's go quickly into some of the best practices. And I want to key and remind the council that when we talk service provider, we've got service provider called out into these best practices. This is inclusive of network provider, service provider, and application provider. Because again, that ecosystem, there's responsibility and accountability that has to be had within each one of those three. So first and foremost, we believe the service provider should, provide consumers an affordable option for battery backup of the CPE device that contains that ATA function. So at the end of the day, that is not done in all instances. I mean, many of these, whether you be a standalone ATA that you go to a big box retailer or an electronic retailer, you can buy an ATA today that does not have any battery backup nor any means to provide that. I think that needs to be something at least is called out, and that we need to work through to be able to justify. If we're going to provide services such as this, how do we deal with this in an environment? And the environment needs to have the ability to have battery backup. Kind of bounce through these just for the sake of time. The service provider should embed an ATA function in a network device that's easily backed up with batteries. In use cases that have multiple devices, which there are many, that have 2 and potentially 3 devices in the home that make up your VoIP solution, all of which need to have individual and specific battery backup, because breakdown of any power, a power outage to any one of those devices would create a disconnect of the service. If you look at kind of 4, 5, and 6, a lot of work that I think that we've done here, but I think there's still work in the industry that needs to be done specifically to technology solutions and how we work through. So again, service providers should work with the network device and CPE vendors to develop approaches for battery backup in use cases with little or no battery backup. Service providers should work with their network device vendors to provide alternative solutions such as power over Ethernet. A lot of these devices, obviously with it being VoIP, a lot of these devices that we're terminating to are Ethernet devices. So as we think through kind of a standardization relative to power over Ethernet into these devices would solve a lot of problems that we're seeing today. So as we think about power over Ethernet and standardization of power over Ethernet, it's a pretty powerful recommendation that we have here. Service providers should work with the vendors to provide consumers with a mechanism for extending the time frame. So again, when we have these events that are extended in length, how do I manage, monitor, and extend the life cycle of the specific UPS or backup mechanism in place? So if I have a multi-day event, how do we deal with that? And what are alternative solutions and powering options that we would potentially be able to have to monitor that, enhance that, and specifically be able to conserve it in the event of a multi-day event. Again, just kind of picking a few out here. Best case 8, service providers should work with the vendors to standard on DC power supplies. One of the things that we looked at as we're thinking about consumer electronics, there's not a standard out there, whether that standard be in power consumption, whether that standard be in interface, or whether it's the standard be in fit, form, and function. There's a lot of issues out there, whether you're terminating to a cell phone, a femtocell, an ATA, a decked cordless phone set. Standardization is one that potentially that we could improve the situation if there were more standards relative to those environments that would allow you to share and work through the powering solutions at the local level. From a supply chain standpoint, and this kind of comes back into an extended environment, many of these UPSs have batteries that you just don't go pick up off the shelf. So from a supply chain standpoint, we believe that the service providers should provide and be accountable for some level of supply chain, and in the event of an outage, offer those consumers who choose battery backup spares at a reasonable price and be able to have those and have inventories, or at least work with someone in a local environment so that those batteries are easily accessible in the event of a power outage, whether that be short-term, long-term, or extended. Best Case 13 kind of talks through installation optimization. A lot of these, as we think about UPSs, we think about power supplies, how they're installed, typically dictates how the life cycle of the battery backup would last. So ventilation, airflow. I mean, a lot of times when I've got technicians that are going out that are installing things, customers are wanting to deal with aesthetics. Can we put this and mount it inside the wall? Can we hide it? I don't want to see this. As we deal with those types of environments, we need to be thinking through that the UPS is there to serve a purpose, and if it's out of sight, it's typically out of mind. We need to deal with the aesthetics and what the customer's desires are. We also need to be thinking about that as it relates to network reliability as well. 16 and 17, obviously dealing with the National Electric Code and dealing with grounding, and as we deal with UPSs and enhancing UPSs and power supplies, doing that in a manner that's consistent and in compliance with the National Electric Code is important. And then I just kind of bounce to the last page here, on 22. Service providers should continue to educate customers and our end users, because again, these power supplies and UPSs are very complex. So we think about the life cycle of what's going on, and as the reference I was making earlier, I've got an ant sitting out and I've got a flashing green lights and red lights. Being able to understand at a glance, very simply, a user interface that could help them understand what is the life cycle of that battery. Does it need to be replaced? Is there an audible alarm? Just that basic life cycle function of the UPSs we work through, and dealing with that as we work through, and that not all of your UPSs are interchangeable. So again, kind of working through that collective standardization piece as you work through. '25 and 26. So we've got a lot of batteries, we've got a lot of battery backup. So we think about disposal, and this is one that we spent considerable time thinking about. You've got different batteries, from lead acid to D-cell to lithium ion to a number of different things that are out there. How we deal with the life cycle on those. So again, continued education. I think it's one that the service providers, application providers, and network providers need to be responsible for helping the customers with appropriate disposition and disposal and recycle. And you can see that the recommendation there, both education on where to get help and how to call to get recycling, as well as providing recycling kits in the event that we get to a life cycle situation with these power supplies. Again, just kind of summing it up, with the flexibility and choice that VoIPs bring us, there are vulnerabilities. I think and feel very confident that what the team has put together associated with the best practices and some of the recommendations, that it clearly will improve and help us manage a more reliable network and a more reliable service delivery as voice as an application as we move it over Ethernet and IP networks. There are a couple of things, and kind of in conclusion, there's still work to be done as we think about batteries and alternative power solutions. As we think about the use of commodity power sources, readily available UPSs that can use things like D-cell batteries and flashlight technologies, and some of those to be able to get something that, in the event of a multi-day outage, you've got something that you can refurbish or replenish readily from a consumer standpoint, versus very standardized very specialized batteries and power solutions that we have today. I think there's a lot of work that can be done around dynamic power utilization to extend the life of these batteries in the event that they're called upon. I think there's work around solar as we think about ONTs and ONUs and how those are deployed in the network today to terminate fiber optic networks and be able to take solar power technology and combined with power over Ethernet and solve a number of these technology and power problems that we have today. From a standardization standpoint, again, I think we can all go, somewhere to our utility room or to our junk drawers and pull it out and find, 15 or 20 AC to DC power supplies that we're not sure what they go to. So I think as we think about this, maybe there's some opportunity for us to, whether it's further CSRIC or through ADIS or through other means, to be able to think through standardization and how can we drive both economics as well as ease of use in this localized power paradigm we find ourselves in today. And with that, just want to kind of open it up to the team and for any questions. Yes, sir.
Oh, very good. Hi, Jay Nalen from T-Mobile. Just looking for a little bit of clarification around a specific scenario. So I think it's going to mostly involve use case 8 and perhaps 9, the femtocells and wireless home scenarios. So if you have an ATA or a modem that's being provided by an ISP or another service provider, and a separate service provider is providing that femtocell, what are the recommendations around the battery supplies or battery backup for those solutions, and who would be responsible or recommended to provide that?
See, that goes back to the whole pieces. From an accountability standpoint, the power supply relative to the network provider, let's just say this, the Ethernet service provider that ultimately is feeding the femtocell, that network device that's providing Ethernet will have to be backed up.
Yeah.
So again, you'd have a UPS for that one. The femtocell is also a locally powered device, and the femtocell provider is going to provide a local power and ultimately a UPS there. One of the things that that is the near-term solution or the current solution. One of the things that the team came back through is if you had a broader adoption of power over Ethernet, you could forward feed or back feed either the network device or network device feeding the femtocell via power over Ethernet from a single UPS. So again, those are that's the future we would like to see. But in today's environment, yes, you're dealing with femtocell battery backup as well as network device battery backup, whether that be Wi-Fi device, wired router, Ethernet, whatever your Ethernet terminating device is.
Thanks.
But I do believe, again, and the team was very vocal on this, that as we think about it specifically as VoIP being the solution, that a more common utilization potentially of something like power over Ethernet would solve a lot of those problems, particularly to your example, where you've got multiple CPE devices in a home.
Yeah, Tim, a couple of questions. First, the on-off switch to extend the period of availability. Did you have any comment from the public safety community members that were a part of your group as to the wisdom of that in a post-disaster situation, given that if we tell all of our consumers, hey, manage your battery power, you don't know how long the outage is going to be, you start turning your phone off, that essentially isolates those consumers from inbound calls as well in a way that would potentially complicate a community's ability to rapidly get changes or additional threats out to the public.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was brought up. I mean, obviously you brought it up in some of the discussion that we had earlier. I mean, we wanted to put as many options on the table as we could because, again, we didn't feel like that this problem was kind of a one-size-fits-all solution. Until we get into an environment where we've got ubiquitous power and a ubiquitous UPS, it is a way to extend, a, you want to call it a lifeline communication mechanism and one way to manage. But no, you're absolutely correct. The vulnerabilities that you wind up for inbound calls is obviously blocked.
Was there any engagement, or did your work maybe suggest future engagement with a broader set of stakeholders having to do with, as we go forward and think about the Internet of Things and the increased digitalization of our lives, what it takes to live, and options for how we make the most out of a difficult post-disaster situation, that we might want to rethink how we plan communities, how we architect for continuity of services post-disaster, so that right now all of the options that I see the group having evaluated are oriented around solving the power situation from a home-by-home, residence-by-residence basis. I was very encouraged recently by the demonstration of a hydrogen fuel cell as backup power for a Node B LTE antenna, and it was able to provide 2.5 days of power for that fully loaded antenna with essentially something no larger than a propane tank supporting a backyard barbecue. If we rethought the notion of, well, maybe there ought to be one of those on every street for 10 homes, and if we just planned communities as we built them out to be all digital Internet of Things, that we would potentially approach the problem differently. Did your analysis, did your work suggest that there may be any value in expanding the dialogue beyond just the communication sector?
Yeah, again, the team looked at a number of, just about everything. I feel like that, as small as the team was, they did a very good job in bringing a lot of options to the table. The majority, and really as the charter was defined, we worked within the sandbox of the communication sector and didn't go into power distribution. But within the communication sector, we did look at, and they did look at, centralized versus distributed power. The problem obviously became, centralized power became a problem because, as you saw from the use cases, only a handful of those have metallic paths. You think about optical network, you think about wireless networks, you think about those, you lose that metallic path, you immediately lose the ability to do a centralized power distribution. But no, we didn't go into the power sector. We didn't look at how do we back up the power grid. We were thinking about how do we back up the communications grid. So
I think to expand the dialogue to include the power community, while the comm sector will no longer, in all cases, have that metallic path into the home.
Right.
That doesn't mean there still won't be a metallic path into the home. But the power company is looking at their challenge, which is, hey, I need to restore it all. And so it's all or nothing for them. If there were, wait a minute, I don't need all. I just need a trickle power in to support the femtocell that is now supported the fixed wireless thing that you all said that is the replacement for pulling the copper out of the house. That's a different dialogue.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting thought. And if I could have put it as option A to have the power company never go out, we'd have been able to solve this in a day.
Yeah. Okay.
Good
Thanks.
point.
I can just tell you that consumers are very concerned about this point and this subject, and continuity of service throughout an outage is not just a couple-hour thing, a couple-day thing, but potentially a couple-week thing. And I very much appreciate the fact that the group looked at the supply chain of how to have new batteries come into the equation and things like that. So I don't think this necessarily closes the chapter on continuity of
of service continuity of power. It's not a disaster, but it certainly contributes very positively to that discussion, and I appreciate the work of the group.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Any questions on the phone? All right, so we'll vote. All those in favor of approval, aye? Aye. All opposed? Anyone on the phone opposed? All right, it's passed. Thanks. Thanks, Tim. So that concludes the recommendations for today. We'll shift gears and we'll move into updates from the rest of the teams. And so we'll start with Brian Joseph, Working Group 2, talking about wireless emergency alerts.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Admiral, and Mike and Jeff, and certainly to the Council. So if we could just pull up the slides, and I'll try to go through these fairly quickly. So we have currently, following our testing report and recommendations that were adopted earlier in the summer, we have 2 active WEA sub-working groups addressing priority deliverables. The first, the ongoing work of the Geographic Targeting, Message Content, and Character Limitation sub-working group, and then our Security sub-working group. And so we're holding separate meetings, reporting back to the full Working Group 2. If we could move to the next slide. So geo-targeting, message content, and character limitation, we are relying on extensively federal government agency and third-party research. We've had a number of academics. We've had DHS Science and Technology studies submitted, their work and research incorporated into the report and recommendations. A number of subject matter experts really from across all of the stakeholder groups on the alert origination side, media and broadcast side, wireless carriers, federal government partners. We've had primarily the work has been done via conference call and certainly exchange of documents via email. We are very close to completion. I think in the next several weeks we will wrap that up, and we'll certainly have the report and recommendations delivered for December of this year. Next slide. And we're looking in that group at enhancements to WEA since deployment, looking at the alert originator needs and desires, consumer needs and desires, while accounting for current and future technical capabilities, looking at public responses, how we fit this into some of the legacy networks and technologies and handsets, backward compatibility issues. We are looking at extending the message length. We are looking at greater granularity in terms of geo-targeting options and paths forward for making that happen, and then larger comprehensive mobile alerting concepts. If we can move to the next slide. We have launched our security sub-working group, and that is addressing the secure origination, transmission, distribution, and receipt of WEA messages. I'm going to knock wood here. No security breaches have occurred to date, and that's significant given the various actors, those who are handling and a part of the alert process, and then there are various touch points. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into, the various touch points, reviewing the research studies. We've seen some also from DHS Science and Technology, Carnegie Mellon, and their Software Engineering Institute, looking at what's happening on the security considerations for alert originators, aggregators. There's the Federal Gateway, the carrier networks, and then certainly the devices in consumers' hands. So obviously security, a key issue that goes across several working groups here. We'll coordinate as appropriate with those other working groups. But we're pleased at the efforts. The scoping continues with that security sub-working group, but I'm confident that we'll be moving forward quickly with further work addressing considerations, potential best practices, certainly on the alert originator and aggregator side for security practices to ensure those are in place. Next slide. In terms of next steps, we will be launching additional sub-working groups. As I said, I think we're nearing wrap-up on the geo-targeting message content sub-working group. We have been discussing greater user configurability and the ability for consumers to control the settings for different alerts as part of WIA. Also looking at accessibility for those with disabilities and those non-English speakers, and then other potential types of WIA alerts. So that's yet to come. We'll continue our face-to-face meetings. We'll continue. It's actually more than weekly calls on some of our groups. It's twice a week, and then we'll be giving our periodic updates to the steering committee and to the full CSRIC. Any questions?
Well, thank you, Brian. I can tell you, Karen Wong, who's the Director of Public Safety Communications in California, told me after the Napa Valley earthquake that they actually had 59 seconds of warning that there's predictive technology out there for earthquakes, but they hadn't considered or plumbed for how to be an injection site for wireless emergency alerts. So the work that you're doing has real practical potential today for use cases today if we increase the utilization of this service. So thanks for the work of your group.
Thank you.
Any questions for Brian? All right, thanks, Brian. Next, let's move to Working Group 3, Larry Walk and Emergency Alert Systems.
There we are. Thank you very much. Working Group 3, Emergency Alert System. We had multiple objectives. In March, we submitted a report about state EAS plans. In June, we submitted a report about the nationwide EAS test and operational issues. And in June, we submitted an initial report on cybersecurity best practices for EAS. Going forward, which I'll just mention briefly more today, we have a final report that's due in December of 2014. It's a very small type, but that's a list of our members. I assure you those are real people, even though you can't read their names. As I said, going forward, we have our EAS Security Subcommittee, chaired by Richard Prelato across the way from me here, and pretending he's not noticing me, and Neil Graves from SNR. The initial cybersecurity report that we submitted in June basically addressed the needs for information assurance and security controls throughout the EAS system. We recommended best practices for EAS cybersecurity hygiene, passwords, firewalls, pretty basic stuff. We try to direct our recommendations to everyone in the EAS ecosystem, including your EAS participants and the state and federal public safety managers who originate EAS alerts, as well as EAS device manufacturers. Our initial conclusions and recommendations were basically that the EAS community, everyone involved, should be adopting these best practices to make sure that EAS is secure, at least in its current state. EAS participants and originators should be incorporating EAS into their IT security program, or create such a program if they still need to. And we offered that report in June really as a starting point, with recommendations that people should, of course, be reviewing and reassessing these best practices going forward as cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities evolve. Next steps, as I mentioned, we have one remaining report that will focus on sort of an assessment of EAS cybersecurity risk management and assessment in the context of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So we'll be basically going through the NIST framework and applying it in the EAS ecosystem, probably largely to EAS participants, and to the extent we can to alert originators. This is just a slide which lays out what the NIST framework provides mechanisms for organizations to do. I don't have to run through that. Everyone should be fairly familiar with that. And just one last point is that Working Group 4, which I believe is up next, they are tasked with developing cyber risk management best practices for communications providers, and they have different subsectors, including one for broadcasting. And one of their goals will be conforming the NIST framework to the communication sector, including the broadcasting sector. So our Working Group 3 will do our best to coordinate with Working Group 4 so that we don't step on any toes, don't overlap or duplicate efforts. There probably still will be some overlap, but we'll do our best to minimize that as much as possible. And as I mentioned, we are shooting to have this final project for our working group for the December CSRIC meeting. That's it for me. Thank you.
All right, any questions, comments? I think we're good. Okay, next up is Working Group 4, Robert Mayer.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I know it's getting late. I'll try to be brief. I first of all want to thank the Admiral and the staff for, I think, the very strong supportive words in the last few days and last night at the FCBA about the work effort underway, which is very significant, and I think you'll see some of that today. Also want to acknowledge the council member Brian Allen, who from Time Warner Cable, who serves as my co-chair, and it's a real honor and privilege to work with him and the other members of the team. Now, if I can figure out how I have to say that it is with some envy that I hear people talk about final reports and recommendations. And when the Admiral said last night that this project was the central proving ground for the new paradigm, I want to thank you for setting such a moderate bar. But besides that, I think everything is really going very well, or in addition to that. So what I'll talk about today a little bit are the goals and objectives of the working group effort, the team and how we're organized. I want to spend a little bit of time on the approach because I think it's appropriate to share with you now some of the substantial progress we've made over the last 6 months in terms of the activities that are underway and how I think they will contribute ultimately to a really important initiative. And then the timeline and next steps. So on the goals and objectives, you heard the Admiral and others talk about language that is now reflected in an updated description. I think it's more closely aligned with what the working group is focusing on. And I will emphasize that as we continue our work over time, we will develop the voluntary mechanisms to provide the assurances that are stated here. But that's a process that is going to evolve based on a lot of the factual data that we're putting together and the evaluations that are underway. And I think it'll be a very natural progression to understand what the appropriate voluntary mechanisms are once the project is a little bit more mature. The assurances really are a reflection of what is in the NIST framework itself. So it talks about individual enterprises having the ability to address risk management from the perspective of their own unique needs, their own risk profile, risk tolerance. And I think that's really a fundamental component of the work that we're doing with NIST and the work that we're doing here. The framework also talks about the meaningful internal and external dialogue that should occur going forward. And I think we all agree that the framework has contributed substantially to that by creating a common taxonomy for us to have a conversation, both internally in the organizations and across the stakeholder community. So one of the other things that I really envy about an admiral is that I suspect that he had a very good command and control organization and hierarchy and a lot of saluting. Nobody salutes me here. We've got 106 people on this team, and all of them, of course, are brilliant and they have great ideas, and I hear about them pretty much every hour. But they are the best. They are really the best thinkers and creative people and hardworking people and dedicated people. And they're from industry, and not only our industry, from other industries, from federal governments, from state government. And I think we've created a level of collaboration across a large number of individuals, which is really unique and very special. The leadership team consists of representatives. I mean, we have 5 segments: broadcast, cable, satellite, wireless, and wireline. Donna Bethea Murphy, who's on the council, is leading the satellite initiative. Matt Tooley, who you heard before speak, is leading the cable sector. John Marino from CTIA is leading the wireless sector. Chris Boyer from AT&T is leading the wireline sector. And Kelly Williams with NAB is leading the broadcast sector. And I'll talk a little bit more about the feeder group initiatives as we go forward, but I also want to acknowledge the work of the advisors, including Donna Dotson, who is a leader on the NIST framework, a very special person, and I think a member of the council, who continues to provide us with encouragement and support as we go forward here in taking the NIST framework to a level of adaptation for our sector. The foundational questions, I think I may have presented these before, but one of the ones I'll point out is the third bullet. And so what do we say here is that we're talking about elevating the industry's ability to understand their risk exposure and risk management posture. Essentially, Working Group 4 is organized to produce segment-specific process roadmaps that build upon a risk management approach reflected in the cybersecurity framework and tailored to 5 common operating environments. So at a high level, it's focused on taking the NIST framework and applying it to the sector, but in a sense, it's only an example of how an organization would themselves go about establishing priorities. And we have a pretty, I think, sophisticated analytical framework that's underneath that will provide guidance in terms of how companies can set their own priorities and make their evaluations. Essentially, the effort takes work that was previously done in CSRIC, especially work around process best practice, combining it with the NIST approach to produce what will be the communication sector and segment risk management approach framework. Now, this slide here looks much too organized. The next one is going to be the one I want to talk to. But essentially, what we've completed now is phase 1. We're in the process of having each of the 5 segments and the feeder groups kind of finalize their initial siloed efforts to develop the content and the structure of the report. Now we're beginning the process of integration where there's communications across, much more communications across the feeder groups and the segments to essentially make sure that it's really well constructed. So I'll take you to this slide, which shows, I think, the dynamic that's underway right now. And it is dynamic. So I'll talk a little bit about the different groups. And basically what's happening is that all of these efforts are interrelated and interdependent in terms of analysis that will lead to findings and recommendations. It's a very dynamic process that's underway. And all of the segments and feeder groups now are having conversations as they evolve. They're not regularly scheduled calls. There's a lot of real-time conversation going on. With respect to the major feeder initiatives, we have one initiative that is looking at small and medium businesses because we recognize that's a special class of providers. They have special challenges. But I also want to acknowledge a comment that was made last night by Matt Tooley, and it's one that I find evidence of in my association, and that is we cannot work under the assumption that all small and medium businesses somehow are unsophisticated with respect to cyber. Many of them are really doing some pretty advanced activities in cybersecurity and are leaders in the area. So this is really to help provide guidance for organizations that really may not have the level of maturity, may not have the resources, and how do they go forward to make the framework meaningful to them. The work that we're doing in the ecosystem, I think, is really very leading edge right now. It actually looks at the very broad ecosystem that impacts the communication sector. Where there are dependencies, those are identified. And these are the conversations that our sector will have with these different stakeholders as we evolve our use of the framework and communicate our needs to these individual either third parties or other stakeholders. It's important that we understand what those relationships look like. They obviously have dependencies on us, but this is comm sector centric, so we wanted to understand what that ecosystem looks like and how it's evolving. The threat piece is also very important because we're looking at, and we're doing some really good work here with Tony Sager and the Council on Cybersecurity. Many of you know Tony's background. He's dealing with some of the top security organizations in the world. Through his contacts, we're beginning to develop a repository of some of the best publicly available information on the threat environments and trying to understand what the vectors are, how that relates to the ecosystem so that we can start having a more targeted conversation about shared responsibilities. And I have to say that it's really important and welcoming to have other participants from other sectors involved in this effort because we really are evolving into a conversation about, you do this, we do this, how do we coordinate? The measurement group is probably one of the most challenging, and we've done work before in CSRIC, specifically CSRIC 3 in Working Group 7, and I think it's an excellent statement of some of the challenges with respect to measurement and some of the things that can be done with respect to measurement. Some of those challenges still apply. Some of the things that can be done are still very, very real and underway. What we have to do is to make sure that we understand what we're measuring, why we're measuring, how it's going to be used, why it's important to do it. It's definitely not measurement for the sake of measurement. And we also have a group of, I think, very leading edge participants who've studied this area, and we're looking at the literature that's out there, we're looking at the organizations that are providing measurement information, we're trying to integrate it into our product in terms of what I'll call key indicators of cybersecurity. And then last but not least, barriers to implementation, we're calling it barriers and challenges. That's an effort to look at the evolution of the adaptation of the framework, to understand whether there are legal, policy, operational, technology, market considerations that could impede an organization from adopting elements of the framework. If there are, what can be done to remediate some of that? And it's very likely that we will make recommendations to the FCC in terms of what we think they might be able to do in terms of helping us mitigate some of the challenges and barriers. In terms of the timeline, as I've indicated, the initial draft reports are probably going to be circulated sometime in mid-October when we meet with the leadership team. We just had our third face-to-face meeting in Washington, D.C. last week. The FCC staff participated in that. I think they were, frankly, impressed with what they heard. It was a good starting point for us for the FCC to see what we're doing and to engage us in some conversation. The industry will produce an interim draft report sometime at the beginning of the year, and then from that we'll make whatever modifications we need to do in advance of submitting it to the council. And then status-wise, I think I've said everything that's important. I just want to make one final point because I think it's an important one, and that's this, that the Working Group 4 effort that started, in a sense, being the foundation at NIST and now in CSRIC, is truly something that is industry-led. And it's very much appreciated that we have the opportunity to do that. We have over 100 people, as I've said. We've got 10 dedicated teams. We have a venue that's been very effective in terms of getting people to focus on developing this work and doing something important. I think NIST recognized that, and I believe the FCC recognizes, and hopefully the Council will recognize that. So we're going to march on. We've got another 6 months probably, or 5 months, or 4 months. I don't know. It's getting collapsed very quickly. But we're looking forward, like I said, I'm looking forward to being able to say it's a final report and recommendation. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, any questions? Great.
Robert, over 100 years ago when commercial telephony first hit the scene and you were in grade school.
I knew Alexander Bell.
That's right. Government near immediately recognized the national security import of what was going on and the need to reconcile the utility of the amazing new capability and the importance of protecting that capability. And the risk management decision at the time was made to arrive at something called one system, one process, one universal service. And that served the nation for decades. Fast forward to the 60s, 70s, in the introduction of the early Internet, and it was the exact opposite regulatory environment, which was, hey, best level of effort. Let's just let this thing evolve. Well, we're now at the point where we're bringing many of the more mature critical infrastructure communications functions that have resisted or for whatever reason not gone on to the Internet backbone, that they're now getting ready to effect those transitions. What your group is doing, in my mind, is really defining the sweet spot of something in between no governance and one system, one universal service, one process, and coming up with the right, responsible way of managing risk without slowing down innovation, yet addressing security and privacy concerns of consumers. So I think you all are to be commended for the work you've done to date. And I just want you all to, if being the central proving ground wasn't enough for you, the nation really is counting on you all getting this right, because this is something that will have impact for decades to come.
Yeah, I thank you, and I appreciate that. And I just want to say one quick point. One of the benefits that existed for many decades was that it was part of one company. It was a monolithic organization with a lot of command and control and a very kind of hierarchical, and we heard the council member talk about that system. So you really had a very good structure for accountability and reporting and protecting certain security interests. With divestiture and subsequently with the IP environment, we have more people in the ecosystem at all layers, and that's a reality. So the responsibilities now are of more of a shared nature, and so this is by no way suggesting in any way that it diminishes our responsibility, but we have to acknowledge that we cannot do it alone. And we have to bring a lot of participants to the table in this current environment. And we should all be motivated by the same interest in national security and also business motivation.
Yeah.
So,
and I think your most powerful new asset that wasn't effectively utilized in the one system, one process, one universal service is the innovation that you're able now to bring to bear into this. So thank you for harnessing that, and we look forward to seeing the report.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. We'll move on. Next up, we have two reports to go, two updates to go. Working Group 8, Kent Bressie. Should be.
So are we live?
Yep.
Yes, great. This will be relatively brief, given the late hour. I'm sure that some of you were thinking that we are the mystery working group, as I think we are the only one not to have presented a report thus far. We were supposed to be presenting our first report today, but it's going to be presented in December, and I'll address that briefly. But just to remind you, Working Group 8 is focused on examining risks to submarine cable infrastructure, which is really the infrastructure of the Internet, and carries almost all of U.S. international voice data and Internet communications. And there are a lot of risks to submarine cable infrastructure, particularly given increases in marine and coastal activity in the United States and around the world. And we're seeing that a lot with different industries and even other activities permitted by other federal, state, and local agencies, whether it's dredging and beach replenishment projects following Hurricane Sandy, whether it's prospective oil and gas development in the Atlantic once the current exploration and development moratorium expires in 2017, to a lot of new issues with offshore renewable energy projects, whether it's wave parks proposed in California or offshore wind farms or things like that. And so there's a real need for examination of these issues, about an understanding of just the core aspects of installation and maintenance of submarine cables, which have not changed radically over time. It's one of the original marine industries, along with commercial fishing, and has been in the marine environment for 150 years, so it's not new. But there's a lot of other new activity out there that is not effectively coordinated. And we're seeing increasingly that a lot of other jurisdictions outside the United States are actually taking a more proactive approach to managing these marine spatial issues and creating cable protection regimes. The United States is actually a laggard in that respect. So this initiative has garnered quite a bit of attention within the submarine cable industry and a lot of participation in our working group. Just briefly, in terms of where we are with our reports, we can move to the third slide. The first report is focused on spatial requirements for submarine cables in relation to each other and other offshore activities and infrastructure. When you're trying to install or repair infrastructure the size of a garden hose that's sitting on the seafloor, potentially hundreds or thousands of meters below, and you're trying to find it, in some cases after it's been installed many years before, with changes in the seabed and sedimentation, you have certain spatial needs to be able to do that. And that increasingly is coming into conflict with other uncoordinated activities. So the focus in Report 1 is really to look at some basic recommendations for the spatial needs for submarine cable systems and other alternative cable protection methodologies that might be used both by industry and that could be promoted by the Commission, particularly with other federal agencies where we see a real need. Report 2 is going to focus more on the intergovernmental coordination at the state, federal, and local levels. There are a lot of permits and licenses required for every undersea cable system, but there is often not a lot of coordination by those entities with other industries that they might regulate. The third report is going to be looking at best practices and government policies for promoting geographic diversity of submarine cables. Right now we have a lot of clustering of routings and landings. That's due in part to the conditions of the seabeds. Some places are more advantageous than others. But also due to other regulatory regimes and other activities. It is often like trying to weave in between a lot of potential threats to land a submarine cable in the United States, and some states in particular do not have particularly favorable regimes. So increasingly on the West Coast we see a lot of cable landings in Oregon, Historically, on the East Coast, the landings have been in New Jersey and New York and also in Florida. There's some exploration of some alternatives. But when you have clustering like that, if you have a natural event like an earthquake or a tsunami or a hurricane or a terrorist attack with such infrastructure clustered closely together, any one incident can damage multiple systems, and that can really impair the U.S. economic activity that is supported by that infrastructure, and also the government communications, because the U.S. government does not own and operate undersea cable systems to carry its telecommunications traffic around the world. They contract with commercial providers for that. So if we could just skip to slide 5, and I'll wrap this up. The first and second reports are now going to be delivered in December, and the third in March. And if we could skip to slide 6. Report 1 is essentially complete. We have one working group participant that is not a working group 8 member that has expressed some concern with the recommendation for a default separation distance between submarine cables and other marine activities in the absence of more specific rules and standards for those particular activities. And that's one of the core recommendations that we hope to put forward. So we're continuing to work within our working group, and we're likely to be noting those concerns in our report, but otherwise advancing that recommendation. And in working through this, we greatly appreciate the support of the FCC staff and of the folks in your bureau, Admiral Simpson, and in particular Michael Connolly, who is our FCC liaison for Working Group 8. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Obviously a very important topic for us. As you look at the spatial separation piece, I'd encourage you, knowing the plans of many other sectors to increasingly utilize the seabed for good, worthy projects, to not just look at this as a binary thing, that it's that distance of separation or nothing, that if you could come up with, and maybe you have in your report, and I'll look for it then, if that spatial separation can't be achieved, are there things that the offending other sector activity might be able to pay for in the cable industry, so that you mitigate the fact that you didn't get the standoff that you think is appropriate, that we've said is appropriate, but if they double the thickness in that section, or add additional layers of RF shielding, or I don't know what it would want to be. I'm going to come up with stupider examples, but I would just hope that it isn't a binary answer.
I don't think we're looking to propose anything binary, and in fact this industry, because it's been around so long, has a long history of working with commercial fishing interests and with offshore oil and gas, and has developed a lot of standard practices to address situations where everybody's trying to crowd into the same area. But we're seeing a lot of more intensive activity and new activities where the players are not cognizant of submarine cables at all. And so we see permit applications for projects directly over significant undersea cable infrastructure with no particular awareness on the part of the companies involved. And so what we're trying to do is create a baseline for certain nearshore activities, recognizing that in many cases there need to be, and this is something we address in the recommendations, more particular standards to address particular activities. To use offshore wind as an example, in the UK, the submarine cable industry and the offshore wind industry jointly developed a series of practices reflected in a recommendation of an organization called Subsea Cables UK because offshore wind is much more intensively developed off the UK coast. So they have certainly developed a more collaborative model for addressing some of those things. That has not happened yet in the United States because, to start with, there just isn't an awareness. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, thank you. And on the geographic diversity piece, please, if there's opportunities for us to highlight to the states any regulatory barriers, legislative barriers, and/or anything that would fit in that category that state governments may be able to work on to improve the attractiveness off of their coastlines, we would definitely want to make sure that we help, in fact, convey that.
I appreciate that. When are you going to California next?
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Okay. Thanks. So our last update today comes from Jay Nalen, Working Group 9. Jay?
Is this on yet? No, very good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned, I'm Jay Nalen, and I have the honor and pleasure of participating in Working Group 9, who is focused on infrastructure sharing during disasters. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll get started with our quick status and readout. So natural disasters, they can and often do cause communications disruptions for multiple reasons. And so part of what we were asked to do as the working group was to explore methods to investigate ways that we can share that infrastructure, whether it's power or transport or whatever it may be, that could help to keep the communication services on air. So in order to do this more effectively, we first split into 3 subcommittees. And the first one would be our wireless network subcommittee, as well as our transport subcommittee, and then finally our backup power subcommittee. And we'll talk about our status of where we're at there. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is our wireless network subcommittee. For those of you who are here in June, you know that we actually put forth our recommendations from this subcommittee in June, and they were passed by the council. And they were primarily focused on roaming during disasters, the processes, best practices, ways to streamline roaming. It also focused on providing a matrix that provides technology, spectrum, and associated contact list. And so Tom, sitting next to me, can attest to this. We have Addis has agreed to take over the ownership and governance of that document, and so we're presently engaged in working with Addis to hand that over to them at this time, and that'll take us to our next working subcommittee, which is the backup power subcommittee. So this subcommittee is being led by Cindy Perez from Cat 5 and Richard Zeno from Sprint. They've done a great job of pulling together several areas and developing some recommendations that are focused around the areas you can see on the slide. We had great representation across the industry, the communications sector, as well as the local, state, and federal agencies. And we had folks that make the manufacturers that make the equipment, whether it's battery backup or generators or fuel cells, are participating in the working group. So we get quite a bit of perspective looking for solutions. The areas that we're focusing on here are, first, here's the site prioritization and coverage, and which would help us identify which areas we want to target first, whether that's hardening the facilities or restoring those facilities after an event, as well as generator design. We're looking at, regarding the generator design, it's the power requirements and hookups for those generators or those permanent generators where we would consider hooking up multiple carriers to one generator, excuse me, at a cell site facility. As you can imagine, there's different power requirements as well as the actual hookup itself. So we're building some recommendations around that standardization. Also, we're looking at regulatory considerations and the resource logistics. So when we're bringing in facilities, whether they're generators or the fuel that would support those generators or power those generators, the resources can often be leveraged or shared as they're coming into a region. So we're looking for opportunities to streamline that and share that information. The recommendations are primarily, excuse me. Thanks, got it, I think. So those recommendations are pretty much finished at this time, and they're being vetted by the member companies, and we're scheduled to review those and submit those recommendations to the council and to the FCC in December during the December council meeting. And that takes us to the Transport Subcommittee. We'll try this again. We'll see how that goes, Tom. So the Transport Subcommittee is being led by Catherine Condello and Joan Vaughn. And also has great representation across the industry in the communication sector. It also incorporates the local, state, and federal agencies, and also the financial sector in this instance, which has provided a lot of good insight and recommendations. So they're primarily focused on the last mile vulnerabilities, best practices to support those. They're looking at alternate transport solutions such as microwave, dark fiber, satellite, and other possible ways that we could share that infrastructure. And those recommendations are also completed at this time. They're being vetted by the member companies, and they'll also go forward in December to the council as a recommendation to the final report in December. And hopefully you could understand most of that as I had the frog try to move out of my throat. But I guess I'd open it up for questions and comments at this time. All right, well, we're on track. Mike, it's back over to you.
Thanks, Jay. So that wraps up today's reports and updates. I'll turn it over to Jeff for a moment for final remarks.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And I'll add my thanks, too. Thank you all for coming in. And again, especially those of you who traveled in. Please get home safely. And when we see you again, it'll be December 3rd. The website says December 5th. We're going to fix that. So just make a note of that. December 3rd, it's a Wednesday. It'll be the holiday season will be ramping up around here, so there'll be things to see. And so we look forward to seeing you in December. Thank you all for all your hard work. Thank your teams for us if you're leading working groups, and have a safe trip home.
Thanks.